Picture this: the stone walls of a great hall flickering with torchlight, the scent of roasted meats wafting through the icy air, nobles wrapped in furs, peasants bundled in layers, and musicians plucking soft notes to drown the howl of the cold. Wind outside, but was it really a warm, jolly gathering, or something far more uncomfortable, a little grim, and not nearly as glamorous as the fairy tales say? Tonight we travel back to those frigid feasting halls of medieval winters and find out what was really on the menu and what wasn't. If falling asleep to the soft clatter of history's forgotten banquets sounds like your kind of evening, you're in good company. Just hit subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss another cozy step into the past. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. You can almost smell the crisp autumn air of 1347 as you stand in the courtyard of Goodrich Castle, watching the endless procession of carts laden with the year's bounty. The harvest season in medieval times was not merely about gathering crops. It was a race against time, a methodical preparation for the months when the earth would sleep beneath snow and ice. For medieval households, autumn meant one thing above all: readiness for winter's long, hungry embrace. The castle's steward, a man named Hugh de Mortimer, stands with his ledger book, carefully noting each cartload as it arrives. His weathered hands move with practiced efficiency, recording bushels of barley, oats, and rye. Behind him, the great stone walls of the castle seem to breathe with anticipation. Soon, these halls will echo with the sounds of winter feasting. But first comes the methodical work of preservation, work that will determine whether the household thrives or merely survives until spring. Medieval food preservation methods required both skill and foresight. The process began not in the castle's kitchens, but in the fields surrounding the estate. Here, peasants worked from dawn until dusk, their backs bent beneath the weight of scythes and sickles. The first harvest had come in summer, hay to feed the animals through winter. Now, in September and October, came the crucial grain harvest that would sustain human life. The timing was everything. Too early, and the grain would not be fully ripened; too late, and autumn rains might ruin the crop where it stood. Hugh had learned this lesson from his father, who had served the previous Lord of Goodrich. Weather patterns were read like ancient texts, clouds interpreted with the same intensity that monks applied to scripture. A red sky at evening promised fair weather for the morrow's harvest, while mare's tail clouds stretching across the horizon warned of storms to come. In the fields, you would have witnessed a sight both beautiful and urgent. Entire families worked. Together, their movements synchronized by years of practice. The men swung their scythes in long, rhythmic strokes, cutting the grain stalks close to the ground. Behind them came the women and children, gathering the fallen grain into sheaves, bundling them with practiced efficiency. The air filled with dust and chaff, and the sound of steel against stem created a constant whisper across the landscape. But the harvest was more than grain. In the castle's orchards, servants climbed ladders to pluck apples and pears from groaning branches. These fruits would not last long in their fresh state, so immediate processing was essential. Some would be dried in the castle's ovens, others pressed into cider that would ferment through the winter months. The process of fruit preservation in medieval times involved careful selection. Only the most perfect specimens could survive the preservation process intact. Root vegetables presented their own challenges. Turnips, carrots, and onions had to be harvested before the first hard frost. Then stored in the castle's cellars where the temperature remained constant. The storage cellars of Goodrich Castle were marvels of medieval engineering, stone-lined chambers dug deep into the earth where the temperature remained steady just above freezing. Here, vegetables could last months if properly arranged, with layers of straw separating each type to prevent spoilage from spreading. The herb gardens demanded particular attention. Sage, rosemary, thyme, and dozens of other plants had to be harvested at precise moments when their essential oils were at peak concentration. In the castle's still room, you would have found the herb mistress, Margot, carefully drying bundles of herbs that hung from the rafters like fragrant chandeliers. These herbs would provide not only flavor for winter meals, but medicine for the household's inevitable winter ailments. As the days grew shorter, the castle's attention turned to the most critical preservation task of all: meat. The annual slaughter season, known as Blod Moneth, or Blood Month, typically occurred in November. This was when most of the year's livestock would be killed and preserved, as there was insufficient feed to maintain large herds through winter. Only the breeding stock and dairy animals would be spared. The slaughter was conducted with military precision. Master butchers from nearby towns were hired to ensure no meat was wasted. Every part of each animal had its purpose: hides for leather, bones for tools and gelatin, organs for immediate consumption, and prime cuts for preservation. The castle's great courtyard would run red with blood, and the air would fill with the sounds of cleavers and the shouts of workers processing the massive quantities of meat. Preservation methods varied depending on the cut and intended use. The finest joints were reserved for the coming winter feasts and received the most careful treatment. Salt curing was the primary method, involving two main techniques: dry salting, where meat was buried in coarse salt for weeks, and brine curing, where cuts were submerged in salt water baths prepared in large wooden tubs. The salt itself was precious, often arriving at the castle in sealed barrels from coastal saltworks or inland mines. Hugh would personally oversee the breaking of each salt barrel, testing the quality with practiced fingers. Poor salt could ruin an entire winter's meat supply, condemning the household to hunger. Good salt, properly applied, could preserve meat for months while adding its own complex flavors to eventual dishes. But salt alone was not enough. The preserved meats would eventually require preparation that masked the overwhelming saltiness of long preservation. This is where the castle's spice stores became crucial. Black pepper, worth its weight in silver, was purchased in small quantities and guarded carefully. Ginger, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg would arrive in precious packets, having traveled thousands of miles from distant eastern markets. These spices would transform salt-hardened meat into palatable winter feasts. The smokehouse, a small stone building adjacent to the castle's kitchens, worked constantly during the preservation season. Here, racks of fish and meat hung in carefully, controlled environments of warm smoke. Oak and apple wood provided the preferred smoking materials, imparting subtle flavors while the heat slowly removed moisture that could lead to spoilage. Master smokers, whose skills were passed down through generations, tended these fires day and night, maintaining the precise temperature that meant the difference between properly preserved food and expensive failure. Fish preservation followed its own seasonal rhythms. While freshwater fish from the castle's ponds could be caught throughout much of the winter, sea fish had to be purchased and preserved during autumn. Salt cod, herring, and mackerel arrived at inland castles in wagon loads, already partially preserved for the journey. These fish would undergo additional preservation at the castle, ensuring they remained edible through the lean months of February and March, when fresh food sources were most scarce. The preservation of dairy products required different skills entirely. cheese wheels, some weighing 50 pounds or more, were carefully aged in the castle's coolest cellars. The cheesemaker, often a woman whose knowledge came from years of experience, would turn each wheel regularly, monitoring the development of rinds and watching for signs of unwanted mold. Hard cheeses could last through winter and even into the following year, providing essential protein and calories when other foods ran low. Butter presented its own challenges. Without refrigeration, butter would quickly turn rancid in warm weather, but properly prepared and stored, it could last months. The traditional method involved working salt deep into the butter, then packing it into sealed earthenware crocks. These crocks were then stored in the coolest parts of the castle, often buried in straw or sand, to maintain consistent temperatures. As autumn progressed, the castle's great hall began to show signs of the coming winter. Tapestries were hung to provide additional insulation against stone walls that would soon radiate cold rather than the summer's stored warmth. The central hearth was prepared for constant use, with enormous stores of firewood cut and stacked in covered yards. The wood itself had been selected and aged, oak for long, steady heat, apple and cherry for pleasant aromas when entertaining guests. The castle's brewhouse worked overtime during these weeks. Beer and ale were essential not just for their nutritional value, but because they were safer to drink than water in an age before sanitation. Huge vats of grain were mashed and fermented, creating the dark, nutritious ales that would sustain the household through winter. The brewmaster, Brother Thomas, supervised every step of the process with the intensity of an alchemist, knowing that a contaminated batch could poison the entire household. Yet for all of this methodical preparation, medieval households lived with constant uncertainty. A single failed harvest could mean starvation. Political upheaval could disrupt trade routes, cutting off access to salt or spices. Disease could decimate livestock before the slaughter season. Weather remained the ultimate master. An early freeze could destroy root vegetables still in the ground, while a warm autumn could cause stored grain to sprout and rot. It was this uncertainty that gave such weight to the autumn preparations. Every preserved ham, every wheel of cheese, every barrel of ale represented security against an uncertain future. The work was backbreaking and endless, but it was also a form of hope, the belief that careful preparation could overcome whatever winter might bring. As November's chill settled over Goodrich Castle, Hugh would walk through the storage chambers one final time before winter's grip tightened. The sight would have been magnificent. Rows upon rows of preserved meats hanging from hooks, barrels of ale stacked 3 high, wheels of cheese aging on wooden shelves, sacks of grain sealed against vermin, and bushels of root vegetables bedded in straw. This was medieval wealth in its most tangible form, not gold or silver, but food sufficient to survive until spring's return. But even as Hugh surveyed these preparations with satisfaction, questions lingered in the cold autumn air. Would the stores truly last until spring? How many guests might arrive unexpectedly, straining the carefully calculated supplies? And what of the servants and peasants who depended on the castle's bounty? Would there be enough to share when winter's hunger reached its peak? The morning frost of early November had turned the castle's courtyards into a crystalline landscape, and Hugh de Mortimer knew that time was running short. The final phase of winter preparation was about to begin, the delicate and crucial work of transforming fresh provisions into foods that could survive the long months ahead. In the depths of Goodrich Castle, a different kind of harvest was taking place, one that would determine not just survival, but the quality of life through winter's darkest days. Deep beneath the castle's main keep, in chambers carved from living rock, the real work of preservation unfolded. These cellars maintained a constant temperature just above freezing, a natural refrigeration system that medieval builders had perfected over centuries. The walls wept constantly with condensation, creating an environment perfectly suited for long-term storage, but requiring constant vigilance to prevent unwanted mold and decay. Master Edmund, the castle's chief preservationist, moved through these chambers with the careful attention of a physician examining patients. Each ham, each wheel of cheese, each barrel of pickled vegetables represented months of careful planning and substantial investment. A single mistake in the preservation process could cost the household dearly when winter's grip tightened and fresh food became impossible to obtain. The salt curing process demanded precise timing and technique. Joints of beef and pork, some weighing 30 pounds or more, were completely buried in coarse salt for periods ranging from several days to several weeks, depending on their size. The salt drew moisture from the meat through osmosis, creating an environment hostile to the bacteria that caused spoilage. But the process was more complex than simply covering meat with salt. Edmund had learned his craft from his father, who had served 3 lords of Goodrich before him. The techniques of dry salting required understanding not just the meat itself, but the quality of the salt being used. Sea salt from the coastal works of Cheshire contained different minerals than rock salt from inland mines, and each type affected the final flavor and preservation differently. The best preservationists could identify the source of salt simply by tasting it, adjusting their methods accordingly. Temperature control during the curing process was critical but challenging. Too warm, and the meat would begin to spoil before the salt could work its magic. Too cold, and the curing process would slow to dangerous levels, allowing harmful bacteria to gain a foothold. Edmund relied on a combination of experience and intuition, moving joints between different storage areas as conditions required. The dampest, coolest chambers were reserved for the longest cures, while slightly warmer areas served for quicker preservation of smaller cuts. The brine curing process presented different challenges entirely. Large wooden tubs, some holding 50 gallons or more, were filled with salt water solutions of carefully calculated strength. Too weak, and the brine would not preserve effectively. Too strong, and the meat would become inedibly salty. The brine itself had to be monitored constantly, as the process of curing actually changed the solution's composition over time. Fresh brine was prepared according to recipes that had been refined over generations. Water from the castle's well was heated in great iron cauldrons, then salt was added until the solution reached the proper density. This was tested using fresh eggs. When the solution was strong enough to float an egg, it was ready for use. Spices and herbs were sometimes added to the brine, bay leaves for their antimicrobial properties, peppercorns for flavor, and occasionally precious imported spices for the finest cuts intended for the lord's own table. The meat had to be completely submerged in brine, requiring careful arrangement and waiting. Wooden planks topped with stones kept joints below the surface, preventing exposure to air that could lead to spoilage. The brine tubs were covered with tight-fitting wooden lids to prevent contamination and reduce evaporation, but they required regular checking. A sour smell or cloudy appearance in the brine signaled potential problems that had to be addressed immediately. Fish preservation followed similar principles but required different techniques. The castle's fishmonger, William E. the Wet, a nickname earned from his constantly damp working conditions, oversaw the preservation of hundreds of pounds of fish each autumn. Freshwater fish from the castle's ponds were available throughout much of winter, but sea fish had to be purchased during autumn trading expeditions and preserved for later use. Salt cod and herring arrived at Goodrich already partially preserved for their journey inland, but they required additional treatment to ensure winter-long storage. The fish were sorted by size and quality, then subjected to additional salting or smoking depending on their intended use. The finest specimens were reserved for the Christmas feast and received the most careful preservation, while lesser fish were processed for daily consumption throughout the winter months. The smoking process required its own specialized knowledge. The castle's smokehouse, a stone building positioned to take advantage of prevailing winds, contained racks that could hold hundreds of pounds of fish and meat simultaneously. Different woods imparted different flavors. Oak provided a strong, long-lasting smoke that penetrated deeply into large joints, while fruitwoods like apple and cherry gave more delicate flavors suitable for fish and smaller cuts. Master Geoffrey, the smokehouse keeper, tended his fires with the dedication of a monk maintaining altar candles. The temperature had to be carefully controlled. Too hot, and the meat would cook rather than cure. Too cool, and the preservation would be incomplete. The smoking process could take anywhere from several days to several weeks, depending on the size of the items being preserved and the intended storage life. The timing of the smoking process was crucial. Items placed in the smokehouse too early in the season might overcure and become too dry and tough for consumption. Those processed too late might not cure thoroughly before winter's cold made fire tending dangerous or impossible. Geoffrey kept detailed mental notes about weather patterns, adjusting his schedule based on decades of experience with Goodrich's particular microclimate. Vegetable preservation required entirely different skills and knowledge. The castle's gardens produced enormous quantities of onions, leeks, carrots, and turnips that had to be stored through winter. Root vegetables were carefully cleaned but not washed. Soil was removed by hand to avoid introducing moisture that could lead to rot. Damaged vegetables were consumed immediately or fed to animals, as any signs of decay could spread rapidly in storage. The root cellar storage system was a marvel of medieval engineering and folk wisdom. Vegetables were layered in wooden boxes, or directly on stone shelves, separated by layers of dry straw or sand that absorbed excess moisture and prevented contact between individual vegetables. Different types of vegetables required different storage conditions. Onions were braided and hung in the driest areas, while root vegetables were buried in sand that was kept just barely moist. Cabbage presented its own preservation challenges and opportunities. While fresh cabbage would not last long in storage, it could be transformed into sauerkraut through controlled fermentation. The process involved chopping cabbage finely, salting it heavily, then packing it tightly into wooden barrels where beneficial bacteria would ferment the sugars into preservative acids. This process took several weeks and required careful monitoring, but the resulting sauerkraut would keep throughout winter while providing essential vitamins that prevented scurvy. Pickling extended the preservation options for many vegetables. Turnips, onions, and even early cabbages could be preserved in vinegar solutions that were flavored with herbs and spices. The pickling process required high-quality vinegar, often made from wine or cider, that had been allowed to ferment a second time. The acidity of the vinegar created an environment hostile to spoilage bacteria, while imparting complex flavors that would enhance winter meals. Dairy preservation demanded perhaps the most specialized knowledge of all. The castle's dairymaids, led by Dame Margaret, possessed skills that had been passed down through generations of women. Cheese-making was both art and science, requiring precise timing and environmental control that determined the difference between valuable aged cheese and expensive failure. The cheese-making process began with fresh milk that was heated to exact temperatures, then treated with rennet to separate curds from whey. The curds were pressed in wooden forms that squeezed out excess moisture. Then the resulting cheese wheels were aged in the castle's coolest, most humid cellars. Different types of cheese required different aging periods. Soft cheeses might be ready in weeks, while hard cheeses could age for months or even years. The aging process required constant attention. Each wheel had to be turned regularly to ensure even aging and prevent the development of unwanted molds. The surface of each cheese was monitored for signs of proper aging, the development of natural rinds that protected the interior while allowing continued fermentation. Dame Margaret could determine the progress of aging by touch, sound, and smell, detecting problems before they could ruin an entire wheel. Butter preservation involved working salt deep into the butter to extract moisture and prevent rancidity. The salted butter was then packed tightly into earthenware crocks with additional salt layered on top to create an airtight seal. These crocks were stored in the coolest parts of the castle, often buried in sand or straw, to maintain consistent temperatures. Properly preserved butter could last through the winter and into the following spring, providing essential fat for cooking and nutrition. The preservation of eggs required its own techniques and timing. Fresh eggs could be preserved for months by coating them with fat or wax to seal the shells, then storing them in containers filled with ash, sand, or grain that prevented them from moving and cracking. Alternative methods involve preserving eggs in lime water or saltwater solutions that prevented spoilage while maintaining nutritional value. Honey, one of the few sweeteners available to medieval households, required careful harvesting and storage to prevent crystallization and fermentation. The castle's beehives, tended by Brother Francis from the nearby monastery, produced honey that was harvested in late autumn when the bees had finished their seasonal work. The honey was strained through linen cloth to remove wax and impurities, then stored in sealed earthenware jars that prevented moisture absorption. The mead-making process transformed some of this honey into an alcoholic beverage that would keep throughout winter while providing both nutrition and pleasure. Honey was dissolved in water, then fermented with wild yeasts or specially cultivated brewing cultures. The fermentation process could take months, requiring careful monitoring to ensure proper development and prevent contamination that could ruin entire batches. As the preservation work continued through November, the castle's storage areas began to fill with the winter's supply. Walking through these areas would have been like touring a medieval treasury. Each preserved item represented security against hunger and uncertainty. The methodical arrangement of supplies reflected not just practical storage needs, but a deep understanding of how different preserved foods would be used throughout the coming months. The preservation schedule was carefully planned to ensure that foods would be ready when needed. Items intended for immediate winter use received lighter preservation treatment that left them more palatable, but with shorter storage life. Foods intended for late winter and early spring received the most intensive preservation treatment, even though this might make them less appealing when finally consumed. The goal was survival first, pleasure second. Yet questions remained as winter approached. Would the preservation techniques prove adequate if the winter lasted longer than usual? How would the stored foods hold up if spring came late, extending the period when fresh food was unavailable? And what would happen if unexpected guests arrived, straining the carefully calculated food supplies? These uncertainties haunted every medieval household as they completed their preservation work and settled in to wait for winter's test of their preparations. December's bitter wind howled around the towers of Goodrich Castle as Hugh de Mortimer conducted his final inventory of the winter stores. 3 months of intensive preparation were drawing to a close, and soon the real test would begin. Could these preserved provisions sustain the castle's household through the long, hungry months until spring? The great wooden doors of the storage chambers groaned open before him, revealing the fruits of autumn's labors, arranged in careful rows and stacks that represented the difference between comfort and starvation. The inventory process was more than simple counting. It was a complex calculation that weighed current supplies against projected needs, considering not just the household's immediate requirements, but also the obligations of medieval hospitality that could not be ignored even in winter's depths. Each preserved ham had to be evaluated for quality and estimated consumption, each wheel of cheese assessed for its current condition and expected longevity. This was medieval mathematics at its most practical and urgent. Hugh's ledger book, its pages covered with neat tallies and calculations, told the story of the estate's survival strategy. 237 souls called Goodrich Castle home during winter months, from the lord's family and their noble guests to the servants, guards and craftsmen who kept the medieval household functioning. Each person represented a specific daily requirement for grain, meat, vegetables and ale, requirements that had been calculated and recalculated as the storage chambers filled throughout autumn. The grain supplies formed the foundation of winter survival. Medieval households consumed enormous quantities of bread, which provided the majority of calories for all social classes. Hugh's calculations showed 42 tons of various grains in storage: wheat for the lord's white bread, rye and barley for the household's daily bread, and oats for both human consumption and animal feed. These numbers had to account not just for immediate consumption, but for the inevitable losses to vermin, spoilage, and the normal wastage of medieval storage methods. The stored grains were housed in the castle's granary, a specialized building designed to protect against moisture and pests. Large wooden bins, raised on stone foundations to prevent ground moisture from seeping in, held the different types of grain in careful separation. Each bin was sealed with tight-fitting wooden covers and checked regularly for signs of insect infestation or rodent damage. Even the best storage methods of the medieval period could not prevent all losses, and Hugh's calculations included a sobering allowance for spoilage. Meat supplies represented both the household's greatest security and its greatest vulnerability. The autumn slaughter had produced massive quantities of preserved beef, pork, and mutton, but meat was also the most likely food to spoil if preservation methods failed. Hugh's inventory included detailed notes about each joint's condition, the texture of the salt-cured hams, the firmness of the smoked bacon, the clarity of the fat surrounding preserved sausages. Any signs of deterioration would require immediate consumption or risk losing valuable protein stores. The salt-cured meats were arranged in the castle's coldest storage chambers, where constant temperatures just above freezing provided optimal preservation conditions. Large hams and joints of beef hung from iron hooks driven into the stone walls, while smaller cuts were packed in wooden boxes with additional salt. The organization was methodical. Meats intended for immediate winter use were stored in easily accessible areas, while provisions meant for late winter and early spring were placed in the most secure and controlled storage spaces. The fish stores required their own careful assessment. Salt cod, preserved herring, and smoked freshwater fish from the castle's ponds filled wooden barrels and hanging racks throughout the storage areas. Fish provided essential protein during the frequent fast days required by medieval religious observance, making these stores crucial for both nutrition and spiritual compliance. The quality of fish preservation was immediately apparent through smell and appearance, and Hugh noted several barrels that would need to be consumed early in the winter season. Dairy products represented a more complex storage challenge. The wheels of hard cheese, some weighing 50 pounds or more, were individually examined for proper aging and the development of protective rinds. Dame Margaret accompanied Hugh on this inspection, her expert knowledge essential for assessing the cheese's current condition and predicting how each wheel would mature through the winter months. Some cheeses were ready for immediate consumption, while others would continue aging and actually improve in quality as winter progressed. The butter stores, packed in earthenware crocks and sealed with salt, represented essential cooking fat that would transform preserved foods into palatable meals. Hugh's inventory noted not just the quantity of preserved butter, but its quality and the effectiveness of the preservation methods. Rancid butter was worse than no butter at all, as it would ruin any dish to which it was added. Vegetable storage presented its own assessment challenges. Root vegetables, turnips, carrots, onions and parsnips were stored in the castle's deepest cellars, where they were layered in sand and straw to prevent contact and reduce spoilage. Each type of vegetable had its own storage requirements and expected longevity. Onions, if properly stored, could last through spring, while turnips might begin to deteriorate by late winter. Hugh's calculations had to account for these varying storage lives when planning winter menus. The preserved vegetable stores included barrels of sauerkraut, pickled onions, and other fermented foods that would provide essential vitamins during the winter months. These preservation methods were newer and less proven than traditional meat and grain storage, requiring careful monitoring for signs of successful fermentation versus dangerous spoilage. The difference between properly fermented vegetables and rotting ones could sometimes be subtle, making expert assessment crucial. Ale and beer stores represented both nutrition and safety, as fermented beverages were often safer to drink than water in medieval times. The castle's brewery had worked overtime during autumn, producing hundreds of gallons of various strengths and qualities of ale. The strongest ales were intended for special occasions and honoured guests, while weaker, small beer provided daily hydration for the household. Hugh's inventory noted the location and strength of each barrel, planning their consumption to ensure the best ales remained available for important winter celebrations. The spice stores, though small in quantity, were enormous in value and importance. These precious imports, pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, would transform preserved meats from merely edible to actually enjoyable. The spices were stored in small, tightly sealed containers and guarded with the same care given to precious metals. A single barrel of black pepper could be worth more than a peasant's annual income, making spice management a crucial aspect of winter planning. Salt itself was stored separately and carefully monitored. The preservation processes had consumed enormous quantities of salt, but supplies had to be maintained for daily cooking and additional preservation needs that might arise during winter. Different grades of salt were stored for different purposes: coarse salt for preservation work, fine salt for cooking, and the precious white salt reserved for the Lord's table. The honey stores provided the household's primary sweetener and medicine. Properly stored honey could last indefinitely, but it required protection from moisture that could cause fermentation. The earthenware jars were sealed with wax and stored in dry areas where temperature fluctuations were minimal. Some honey was reserved for mead production, while the finest honey was saved for special occasions and medical uses. Fuel stores were as crucial as food for winter survival. The castle's woodyard contained carefully arranged piles of different types of wood: oak for the great hearth in the hall, fruitwood for cooking and pleasant aromas, and pine for quick-burning fires in servants' quarters. The quantity of firewood was calculated based on previous winter's consumption, but weather patterns could dramatically affect fuel needs. A particularly harsh winter could exhaust fuel supplies, leaving the household cold and unable to cook properly. As Hugh completed his inventory, he faced the complex calculations that would determine the household's survival strategy for the coming months. The numbers were encouraging but not overwhelming. There was sufficient food to sustain the castle's population through a normal winter, with modest reserves for emergencies. However, medieval life was filled with unexpected challenges that could quickly transform adequate supplies into dangerous shortages. The calculation had to account for the unknown variables that made medieval planning so challenging. How many unexpected guests might arrive seeking winter shelter? Would the winter be particularly harsh, increasing both food consumption and fuel needs? Would any of the preserved foods spoil unexpectedly, requiring replacement from dwindling stores? Would spring arrive on schedule, or would the winter extend into what should be the growing season? Medieval hospitality customs complicated these calculations significantly. The obligations of noble households to provide food and shelter to travelers and guests could not be ignored even when supplies were limited. A lord who turned away travelers during winter could face serious damage to his reputation and political relationships. Yet, each additional mouth to feed reduced the security of the entire household. The social hierarchy of the castle also affected consumption calculations. The lord's family and noble guests expected food of higher quality and greater variety than the servants and workers. Meat consumption varied dramatically by social status, with the nobility consuming significantly more protein, while servants might survive largely on bread, porridge, and occasional meat. These distinctions had to be factored into supply planning. Religious observances added another layer of complexity to winter food planning. The medieval church calendar included numerous fast days throughout winter when meat consumption was forbidden and fish became essential. The timing of these religious observances was fixed, but their impact on food stores depended on the household's level of religious compliance and the availability of acceptable alternatives to meat. Economic considerations also played a role in winter food management. Some preserved foods might be sold if prices were favorable, providing income that could be used to purchase other necessities. However, selling food stores during winter was always risky, as replacement might be impossible if unexpected needs arose. Hugh had to balance the potential economic benefits of food sales against the security provided by maintaining full stores. The inventory process revealed both the strengths and vulnerabilities of the medieval preservation system. The diversity of preservation methods, salting, smoking, drying, fermentation, provided multiple safeguards against total food loss. If one preservation method failed, others might still provide adequate nutrition for survival. However, the system was entirely dependent on autumn preparation. There was no possibility of replacing spoiled food until spring brought fresh options. Weather patterns during storage could dramatically affect the success of preservation methods. Unusually warm winter weather could accelerate spoilage, while extreme cold could freeze and damage stored vegetables. Humidity levels in storage areas had to be carefully managed. Too dry, and foods might desiccate beyond use. Too moist, and mold and rot could destroy entire stores. The psychological aspects of winter food storage were as important as the practical concerns. The sight of well-filled storage chambers provided reassurance and confidence that the household could survive winter's challenges. Conversely, dwindling supplies created anxiety and stress that affected the entire community's morale. Hugh's role extended beyond mere accounting to include managing the household's emotional response to their food security situation. As December's short days gave way to the depths of winter, Hugh's careful calculations would face their ultimate test. The preserved foods that filled Goodrich Castle's storage chambers represented months of planning, weeks of intensive labor, and the accumulated wisdom of generations of medieval households. Whether these provisions would prove adequate would depend not just on the quality of the preservation work, but on the particular challenges that this winter would bring. The great wooden doors of the storage chambers closed with a solid thud that echoed through the castle's corridors. Inside, the carefully arranged supplies waited in the cold darkness, ready to sustain life through winter's trial. But even as Hugh locked the doors and sealed the chambers, questions lingered in the winter air. Would these stores truly last until spring's return? And what stories would they tell of medieval survival when the season finally ended? In the depths of Goodrich Castle, Long before the first pale light of winter dawn touched the frosted windowsills of the great hall, the day began with the soft shuffle of feet on stone floors and the whispered prayers of servants preparing for another day of endless work. You can almost feel the bone-deep cold that filled every corner of the castle in those dark December mornings of 1347, when the only warmth came from the dying embers of carefully banked fires and the shared body heat of servants huddled in their modest quarters. Medieval servant life during winter began each day at the first bell of Lauds, around 4 in the morning, when the chapel bell tower echoed its call across the silent courtyard. In the servants' dormitory, a long, low chamber beneath the great hall, 23 souls stirred under thin woolen blankets that provided little protection against the penetrating cold. The dormitory's single window, covered with oiled parchment, rather than glass, allowed no light to enter, but plenty of winter air through gaps that no amount of stuffing could completely seal. Margaret of the kitchen was always the first to rise, her internal clock refined by 15 years of service in the castle's depth. At barely 5 feet tall and weathered by constant exposure to fire and steam, she moved through the darkness with the confidence of someone who knew every stone of these familiar spaces. Her bare feet, hardened by years of walking on cold floors, made no sound as she felt her way to the small oil lamp that would provide the first light of the day. The process of lighting the lamp was itself a small miracle of medieval technology and economy. Every drop of oil was precious, so the lamp was trimmed each evening to burn as slowly as possible through the night. Margaret's skilled fingers could light the wick with a single spark struck from flint and steel, a technique she had mastered as a child in her village before entering service. The tiny flame that resulted cast dancing shadows on the dormitory walls, revealing the sleeping forms of her fellow servants wrapped in whatever additional clothing they possessed. The servants' clothing during winter was a study in practical layering and creative adaptation. Margaret wore a rough woolen chemise beneath a heavier woolen gown, both garments mended countless times until they resembled patchwork quilts more than original fabric. Over this went a thick leather apron that protected her clothing from the kitchen's constant hazards, splashing grease, flying sparks, and the inevitable stains of food preparation. Her feet were wrapped in wool cloth before being pushed into wooden clogs that kept them elevated above the perpetually damp stone floors. As Margaret prepared for the day, other servants began to stir in response to her movements. Thomas the undercook, a sturdy man of perhaps 30 years whose arms bore the permanent scars of kitchen accidents, rolled from his sleeping place near the dormitory's single brazier. The brazier, filled with carefully banked coals from the kitchen fires, provided minimal warmth, but was essential for preventing the servants from freezing during the coldest nights. The morning routine followed patterns established over generations of castle service. Each servant had specific responsibilities that had to be completed before the household above stairs began to stir. These tasks were performed in near silence, not from any formal rule, but from the practical necessity of not disturbing the sleep of those whose displeasure could mean immediate dismissal and winter homelessness. Young Will, barely 14 and newest to castle service, was responsible for carrying water from the castle's well to fill the great cauldrons in the kitchen. This task began before dawn and continued throughout the day, as medieval cooking and cleaning required enormous quantities of water. The well was located in the castle's inner courtyard, requiring Will to navigate stone steps made treacherous by winter ice while carrying heavy wooden buckets that could freeze solid if left outside too long. The castle's well was a marvel of medieval engineering, extending more than 60 feet down through solid rock to reach water that remained liquid even in the harshest winters. The water itself was precious, not just for drinking and cooking, but for the endless washing and cleaning that kept a medieval household functioning. Will's morning trips to the well were made by the light of a small lantern, its candle protected by horn panels that allowed light through while blocking wind. Agnes the laundress faced perhaps the most challenging work of all during winter months. The castle's laundry had to continue regardless of weather, but winter made every aspect of her work exponentially more difficult. Water had to be heated over fires that consumed precious fuel, while wet clothing had to be dried in spaces where moisture could cause dangerous mold and mildew. Agnes began her day by rekindling the fires under the great washing cauldrons, a process that required careful attention to conserve fuel while providing adequate heat. The laundry process in medieval times was back-breaking work that could consume an entire day for a single load of washing. Medieval households generated enormous quantities of dirty linens, from the table linens used in the Great Hall to the bed linens of the noble family and their guests. Agnes and her assistant, young Mary, had to sort the washing by fabric type and level of soiling, as different materials required different treatment methods. The finest linens belonging to the lord and lady received the most careful attention. These expensive fabrics, often imported from distant lands, could be ruined by harsh treatment or improper drying. Agnes used specially prepared soap made from ash and animal fat, carefully testing the strength of each batch to ensure it would clean without damaging delicate fibers. The washing water itself had to be heated to precise temperatures. Too hot, and it could shrink or damage the fabric. Too cool, and it would not effectively remove stains and odors. Brother Francis, the castle's chaplain, rose even earlier than the servants to prepare for morning prayers. His cell, located in a small tower above the chapel, was only slightly warmer than the servants' dormitory, but his religious duties required him to be ready to conduct services regardless of personal comfort. The chapel itself was unheated except for small braziers that provided minimal warmth during services, making winter worship a test of faith and endurance. The chapel's stone walls and floors conducted cold with merciless efficiency, making it one of the most uncomfortable spaces in the entire castle during winter months. Brother Francis's morning preparations included lighting the altar candles and preparing the sacred vessels for Mass, work that had to be done with fingers stiff from cold. The chapel's small windows, filled with expensive colored glass, provided beauty but no warmth, and frost often formed on their inner surfaces during the coldest nights. Down in the kitchen, the day's food preparation began with the monumental task of rekindling the great hearth fires that had been carefully banked the previous evening. This process required skill and patience, as the fires had to be brought back to full heat gradually to avoid wasting precious fuel. Margaret supervised this process personally, knowing that the kitchen fires were literally the heart of the castle's daily life. Without them, there could be no cooked food, no heated water, and no warmth for the essential work of food preparation. The kitchen itself was a cathedral of medieval efficiency, with its soaring stone-vaulted ceiling designed to carry away smoke and heat from the great hearth. The hearth dominated one entire wall of the kitchen, large enough to roast an entire ox when needed for special occasions. During winter, it served as the castle's primary source of warmth for the servants, who worked as close to the fires as safely possible while performing their daily tasks. Preparing the kitchen for the day's work involved far more than simply lighting fires. Every cooking vessel had to be cleaned and arranged, every knife sharpened, every work surface prepared for the endless cycle of food preparation that sustained the castle's household. The kitchen's wooden tables, scarred by years of chopping and cutting, had to be scrubbed with sand and salt to remove the residue of previous meals while preventing the accumulation of food particles that could attract vermin. The morning inventory of food supplies was a crucial daily ritual that determined what meals could be prepared and what preserved foods needed to be retrieved from storage. Margaret walked through the kitchen's pantry areas with the systematic attention of a military quartermaster, noting which fresh supplies were available and which preserved foods needed to be prepared for consumption. This daily planning was essential for managing the castle's carefully calculated winter stores. The servants' breakfast was a simple affair that had to be prepared and consumed quickly before the more important work of preparing meals for the household above stairs could begin. A pot of porridge made from oats or barley, perhaps flavoured with a small piece of preserved meat or a handful of dried herbs, provided the energy needed for the physical demands of castle service. This porridge was often the servants' most substantial meal of the day, as their other meals consisted mainly of bread and whatever scraps remained from the household's dining. Ale or weak beer accompanied the morning meal, as these fermented beverages were safer to drink than water and provided additional calories essential for hard physical work. The servants' ale was of much lower quality than that served to the household above stairs, often thin and sour compared to the rich, strong ales reserved for noble consumption. Yet even this humble beverage was precious during winter, when the brewing process had to compete with other demands for fuel and grain. As the servants consumed their simple breakfast, the first sounds of the awakening castle began to echo through the stone corridors above. The lord and lady of the castle would not rise for several more hours, but their body servants had to begin preparations well in advance. Dame Eleanor, the lady's personal maid, left the servants' breakfast early to begin the complex process of preparing her mistress for the day. Dame Eleanor's work involved far more than simply helping the lady dress. The elaborate clothing worn by medieval nobility required assistance to put on properly, with multiple layers of undergarments, heavy outer garments, and complex fastenings that could not be managed without help. Winter clothing was particularly challenging, as the thick fabrics and multiple layers needed for warmth made movement difficult and required careful arrangement to maintain both comfort and appearance. The process of heating the noble family's chambers was another early morning task that required careful coordination. Small braziers filled with glowing coals had to be carried through the castle's corridors and carefully positioned to provide warmth without creating fire hazards. The charcoal used in these braziers was expensive and had to be used sparingly, requiring servants to calculate precisely how much heat was needed and when it should be provided. The castle's firewood stores, carefully accumulated during autumn preparations, were managed with the precision of a military campaign. Different types of wood served different purposes: oak for long-burning fires in the great hall, fruitwood for pleasant aromas when entertaining guests, and pine for quick fires in servants' areas. Each servant involved in fire management had to understand these distinctions and use the appropriate wood for each situation. As dawn finally began to lighten the castle's small windows, the servants' morning preparation phase drew to a close. The kitchen fires were burning steadily, water was heated and ready for use, and the first steps of food preparation were underway. The castle above stairs remained quiet, but the infrastructure that supported noble life was already functioning with the smooth efficiency that marked a well-managed medieval household. Yet even as the servants completed their morning tasks, questions lingered in the cold air of the castle's lower chambers. Would the winter prove harsh enough to strain the carefully managed fuel supplies? How many unexpected guests might arrive, multiplying the servants' workload during the busy feast season? And would their own meagre food allocations prove sufficient to sustain them through the physical demands of serving a medieval household during winter's most challenging months? By the time the castle's chapel bell tolled prime at 6 in the morning, the servants' quarters had transformed from a place of rest into a bustling centre of coordinated activity. The dormitory that had sheltered sleeping forms just hours before now echoed with the sounds of preparation as 23 individuals prepared to serve the needs of a household that would soon awaken expecting seamless comfort despite the harsh realities of winter. The allocation of daily tasks followed a hierarchy as rigid as that of the noble family above stairs, but based on entirely different principles. Medieval castle servants were organized according to skill, experience, and the trust they had earned through years of faithful service. Margaret of the kitchen, with her 15 years of experience, commanded respect that transcended her humble birth, while young Will, despite his noble blood, occupied the lowest position in the servants' hierarchy due to his recent arrival and lack of practical skills. The kitchen staff worked with the coordinated precision of a military unit, each member performing specialized tasks that contributed to the greater goal of feeding the entire household. Thomas the undercook had already begun the process of preparing the day's bread, a task that began long before dawn and continued throughout the morning. The bread-making process in a medieval castle was a complex operation that required precise timing and considerable physical strength. The great stone ovens built into the kitchen walls could accommodate dozens of loaves simultaneously, but they had to be heated properly before the baking could begin. Thomas supervised the process of burning hardwood in the oven chambers until the stone walls glowed white-hot, then raking out the coals and ash to leave clean, evenly heated surfaces. The temperature of the ovens was tested by tossing handfuls of flour onto the hot stones. When the flour browned in exactly the right number of seconds, the ovens were ready for bread. Different types of bread required different baking times and oven temperatures, creating a carefully orchestrated schedule that maximized the use of the expensive fuel. The finest white bread, made from carefully sifted wheat flour, was baked first when the ovens were at their hottest. This bread was reserved for the Lord's table and honored guests, its pure white color and fine texture marking it as a luxury item that demonstrated the household's wealth and status. After the white bread came the brown bread consumed by the household's lesser members, made from wheat flour that included more of the grain's bran and darker components. This bread was heartier and more nutritious than the refined white bread, but its coarser texture and darker color marked it as food for those of lower social status. The servant's own bread came last, often made from rye or barley flour mixed with whatever grain was most abundant in the castle's stores. Agnes the laundress had begun the day's washing, while the kitchen staff worked on bread preparation. The great wooden tubs used for laundry had to be filled with water heated over the kitchen fires, a process that required careful coordination to avoid interfering with food preparation. The water itself had to be heated to different temperatures for different types of washing, boiling hot for heavily soiled items, warm for delicate fabrics, and cold for certain types of stains that could be set permanently by heat. Medieval laundry work was a weekly ordeal that could consume 2 full days when weather permitted drying. Agnes had learned to read weather patterns with the skill of a sailor, as wet laundry left hanging during unexpected storms could freeze solid or be ruined by sudden snow. The castle's laundry had to be planned around weather forecasts that were based entirely on observation and traditional knowledge passed down through generations. The washing process itself was back-breaking work that required both strength and skill. Agnes and her assistant Mary used wooden paddles to agitate the soaked linens in the great tubs, working the soap through the fabric fibers while avoiding damage to expensive textiles. The finest linens received individual attention, being rubbed gently by hand with specially prepared soap that was milder than the harsh lye soap used for everyday washing. Young Will's water-carrying duties expanded throughout the morning as the castle's various activities created demand for fresh supplies. The kitchen alone required enormous quantities of water for cooking, cleaning, and the constant washing of dishes and utensils. The castle's latrine chambers needed regular cleaning with fresh water, while the lord and lady's private chambers required heated water for washing and other personal needs. The well itself was a source of constant concern during winter months. While the water rarely froze completely due to the well's depth, ice could form around the rope and bucket mechanism, making drawing water dangerous and difficult. Will had learned to break ice carefully around the wellhead each morning, using techniques that prevented damage to the delicate rope and pulley system that made water collection possible. Dame Eleanor's work with the lady of the castle began long before her mistress awakened. The process of preparing for a noble lady's day involved heating the private chambers, laying out appropriate clothing, and ensuring that all the accessories and personal items needed for the day were clean and ready for use. This preparation had to be completed silently, as disturbing the lady's sleep was a serious breach of protocol that could result in punishment. The lady's winter clothing was a marvel of medieval craftsmanship and social display, but it was also remarkably impractical for daily wear. Multiple layers of linen undergarments provided warmth and protected expensive outer garments from body, oils and perspiration. Over these went heavy woolen gowns lined with fur or silk, depending on the occasion and the lady's wealth. The outer garments were often decorated with embroidery, jewels, or fur trim that marked the wearer's social status while providing additional warmth. The process of dressing a medieval noblewoman could take more than an hour when formal occasions required elaborate clothing and accessories. Dame Eleanor had to understand not just how to arrange the various garments properly, but also how to coordinate colors and styles that reflected current fashion while appropriate to the day's planned activities. Winter clothing was particularly challenging because warmth had to be balanced against appearance and mobility. Brother Francis's morning duties extended beyond the chapel services to include managing the castle's limited literacy resources. As one of the few people in the castle who could read and write with skill, he was responsible for maintaining records, writing letters for the Lord, and managing the small collection of books that represented enormous wealth in an age when each volume had to be copied by hand. The chapel itself required daily maintenance that was complicated by winter conditions. The stone floors had to be swept and cleaned, despite the mud and snow tracked in by worshippers, while the altar linens and vestments needed regular washing and care. The chapel's few books, a Bible, a prayer book, and perhaps a saint's life, were precious beyond measure and had to be protected from moisture, cold, and the ever-present threat of fire. The timing of morning prayers had to accommodate the complex schedule of castle life. The household's noble members were expected to attend morning mass, but their arrival had to be coordinated with their personal preparation schedules. Servants attended prayers when their duties permitted, often standing in the back of the chapel, during brief breaks in their work schedules. As the morning progressed, the servants' work expanded to include direct service to the awakening household above stairs. Personal servants carried heated water to their masters' chambers, lit fires in private rooms, and began the complex process of helping noble family members dress for the day. This personal service required discretion, skill, and the ability to anticipate needs before they were expressed. The great hall itself required extensive preparation each morning before it could serve as the center of household life. The long tables used for dining were assembled from trestles and boards stored against the walls, then covered with clean linen cloths that had been washed and pressed by Agnes and her assistants. The high table, where the lord and lady would sit, received special attention with the finest linens and the most careful arrangement of chairs and cushions. The hall's great fireplace had to be cleaned of the previous day's ashes and prepared for a new fire that would provide warmth during the day's meals and activities. This fireplace was enormous, large enough to burn entire tree trunks, and its proper management required understanding of different wood types and burning techniques. The fire had to provide steady warmth without creating excessive smoke that would make the hall uncomfortable for dining and conversation. Food preparation for the household's breakfast required coordination between multiple servants working on different components of the meal. While Thomas supervised bread baking, other kitchen staff prepared porridge, cooked preserved meats, and heated ale for the morning meal. The quality and variety of breakfast foods varied dramatically according to social status, with the lord's family receiving the finest foods while servants made do with simpler fare. The preservation of food stores required daily attention even during consumption. Preserved meats had to be checked for signs of spoilage, while stored vegetables needed regular sorting to remove items that were beginning to rot before they could contaminate the rest of the supplies. This daily management of food stores was crucial for making the winter provisions last until spring brought fresh options. The servants' own midday meal was typically consumed quickly during brief breaks in their work schedule. A piece of bread, perhaps with a small portion of preserved meat or cheese, had to provide the energy needed for afternoon tasks that were often more demanding than morning duties. The servants ate standing in the kitchen or other work areas, as they had no dedicated dining space and no time for leisurely meals. The hierarchy among servants became most apparent during meal preparation and service. The most experienced servants were responsible for tasks that required skill and discretion, such as carving meat and serving wine, while newer servants performed manual labor and basic food preparation. This hierarchy provided career advancement opportunities for those who proved themselves reliable and skilled over years of service. Water management throughout the castle required constant attention from multiple servants. Beyond the basic needs, for cooking and cleaning, water was needed for the castle's primitive sanitation systems, for maintaining the moat if the castle had one, and for various crafts and maintenance activities. During winter, this water often had to be heated, creating additional demands on the castle's carefully managed fuel supplies. The castle's animals also required daily care that was complicated by winter conditions. Horses, cattle, pigs, and chickens all needed food, water, and shelter maintenance that kept several servants busy throughout the day. The animals' health was crucial for the castle's survival, as they provided transportation, food, and essential services that could not be replaced if disease or cold weather caused losses. As afternoon approached, the servants' work pace intensified in preparation for the day's main meal. The great hall had to be fully prepared for dining, with tables set, fires burning brightly, and all the complex arrangements needed for proper medieval dining completed. The kitchen had to coordinate the preparation of multiple dishes that would be served simultaneously, requiring precise timing and coordination among all the cooking staff. Yet questions remained as the servants continued their relentless daily routine. Would their strength hold up under the physical demands of winter service when cold weather made every task more difficult? How would they manage if illness struck members of the small servant staff, creating gaps in the carefully coordinated work schedule? And would their own modest food allocations provide adequate nutrition for the intensive physical labor that sustained the castle's daily life through the long winter months ahead? The afternoon hours of a December day in 1347 brought the most intense period of activity in the servants' daily routine, as the preparation for the household's main meal required every skill and ounce of energy that the castle's below-stairs community could muster. As the pale winter sun reached its highest point above Goodrich Castle's towers, the kitchen became a cathedral of controlled chaos. with servants moving through clouds of steam and smoke in a dance choreographed by years of experience and necessity. Margaret, of the kitchen, stood at the center of this orchestrated activity like a general commanding troops in battle. Her domain extended beyond the kitchen itself to encompass the pantries, storage chambers, and serving areas that formed the invisible infrastructure supporting the castle's daily life. The feast being prepared this day was not one of the great ceremonial banquets that mark Christmas or Easter, but rather the everyday meal that demonstrated the household status while providing essential nutrition during winter's lean months. The complexity of medieval feast preparation became apparent as multiple dishes were prepared simultaneously using different cooking methods and ingredients. The great hearth accommodated several large pots simultaneously, each containing different courses that would appear on the Lord's table. A massive cauldron of beef stew simmered slowly over glowing coals, its contents enriched with preserved vegetables and carefully hoarded spices that transformed tough, salt-cured meat into something approaching palatability. Thomas the undercook supervised the roasting of a joint of pork that had been retrieved from the castle's preservation chambers. That morning, the meat, hard and salt-crusted from months of curing, had been soaked in fresh water to remove excess salt, then rubbed with precious spices and wrapped in a coating of herb-infused fat. The roasting process would take most of the afternoon, requiring constant attention to ensure even cooking and proper basting that would restore moisture to the preserved meat. The kitchen's smaller fires were used for more delicate cooking tasks that required precise temperature control. Agnes had temporarily abandoned her laundry duties to assist with the preparation of sauces that would accompany the main dishes. Medieval sauces were essential for making preserved foods palatable using combinations of wine, vinegar, honey, and spices to create complex flavors that masked the saltiness and toughness of long-stored provisions. The sauce preparation required skills that bordered on alchemy, as the proportions of ingredients had to be adjusted based on the quality and age of the preserved foods being served. Older preserved meats required stronger, more acidic sauces to cut through their intense saltiness, while recently preserved items could be enhanced with subtler combinations of herbs and mild spices. Margaret tested each sauce personally, her palate refined by years of experience with the varying quality of preserved provisions. Young Will found his water-carrying duties multiplied during the feast preparation, as the kitchen's enormous appetites for fresh water increased dramatically. Beyond the basic needs for cooking and cleaning, water was required for the constant washing of dishes and utensils that accumulated as multiple courses were prepared simultaneously. The kitchen's wooden work surfaces had to be scrubbed between different food preparations to prevent flavors from mixing inappropriately. The bread service for the afternoon meal required its own complex coordination. Different types of bread served different purposes during medieval dining. Thick slices of day-old bread became trenchers that served as plates, while fresh bread provided immediate sustenance and demonstrated the household's prosperity. Thomas had timed the bread baking to ensure that some loaves would emerge from the ovens still warm when the meal was served, filling the great hall with the aroma of fresh baking that marked a successful household. Dame Eleanor's responsibilities expanded during feast preparation to include coordinating the service of the meal itself. As the lady's personal servant, she understood the social intricacies of medieval dining and could ensure that the proper protocols were followed. The seating arrangements in the great hall reflected precise social hierarchies that had to be maintained even during everyday meals, with each person's position relative to the Lord's high table, marking their status within the household. Preparation of the great hall for dining required the coordinated efforts of multiple servants working under Dame Eleanor's supervision. The The tables, assembled from trestles and boards, had to be arranged in precisely the correct configuration for the day's expected diners. The high table where the lord and lady sat was positioned on a raised platform that allowed them to oversee the entire hall while emphasizing their elevated status above all other diners. The table settings reflected both practical needs and social distinctions. Each place was marked with a trencher, a thick slice of day-old bread that would serve as a plate throughout the meal. Shared between diners were bowls for salt, jugs containing ale or wine, and communal dishes that required coordinated serving. Only the lord and perhaps his lady had individual cups. Other diners shared drinking vessels that reinforced the communal nature of medieval dining. The service of wine and ale required special attention during winter months, as these beverages were often served warm to provide additional comfort against the cold. The castle's limited supply of imported wine was reserved for special occasions and honoured guests, while locally brewed ale provided the daily beverage for most household members. The ale had to be heated carefully to avoid spoiling its flavour, requiring servants who understood the precise temperature that enhanced rather than damaged the drink. As the afternoon meal preparation reached its climax, the kitchen staff faced the challenge of coordinating the completion of multiple dishes that had to be ready simultaneously. Medieval dining customs required that several courses appear on the table at once, creating logistical challenges that tested the servants' organizational skills. The timing was crucial. Food that was ready too early would cool and become unappetizing, while delays could leave diners waiting and potentially angry. The carving of meat was a specialized skill that fell to the most experienced kitchen servants. Medieval carving techniques were complex arts that required understanding of anatomy, knife skills, and social protocol. Different cuts of meat were reserved for different social classes, with the choicest portions going to the lord and his immediate family, while lesser cuts were distributed according to strict hierarchical rules. The preserved meats presented particular carving challenges, as the salt curing process made them harder and more brittle than fresh meat. The carvers had to understand how to work with these preserved textures, slicing the meat in ways that maximized tenderness while presenting attractive portions. The appearance of the carved meat was almost as important as its taste. As medieval dining was a visual as well as culinary experience. Fish preparation added another layer of complexity to the meal service, as religious requirements often dictated that fish be served on certain days regardless of the season. The castle's preserved fish stores included salt cod, smoked herring, and pickled freshwater fish that required different preparation techniques. Salt fish had to be soaked to remove excess salt, then carefully cooked to restore palatability, without destroying the delicate textures that proper preservation had maintained. The serving process itself was a carefully choreographed ritual that reflected medieval social structures and dining customs. Servants entered the great hall in prescribed orders, carrying dishes that were presented according to strict protocols. The lord and lady were served first, followed by guests in order of their social importance, then family members and household officials according to their rank within the castle's hierarchy. Brother Francis played his own role in the dining ritual, offering prayers before the meal that blessed both the food and those who would consume it. These prayers served multiple purposes. They fulfilled religious obligations, provided a formal beginning to the meal, and created a moment of unity among diners who might otherwise be separated by significant social differences. The chaplain's blessing transformed eating from mere physical necessity into a religious and social act. The servant's own meal was a much simpler affair that had to be consumed quickly during brief breaks in their serving duties, while the household above stairs enjoyed multiple courses and fine beverages. The servants made do with bread, porridge, and whatever small portions of preserved meat their status allowed. Their ale was thin and often sour compared to the beverages served to their social superiors, but it provided essential nutrition and hydration for their physically demanding work. The quality of the servants' food varied depending on the castle's prosperity and the generosity of its lord. Generous households might allow servants to eat the less choice portions of the preserved meats, while more economical establishments kept the servants on diets that consisted primarily of grain-based food supplemented with minimal protein. During lean times, servants might receive barely enough food to maintain their working capacity. The cleanup after the afternoon meal required as much coordination as the preparation and service had demanded. Every dish, cup, and utensil had to be washed in water heated over the kitchen fires, then dried and stored properly for future use. The great hall's tables had to be disassembled and stored, while the floors required sweeping and cleaning to remove the debris inevitably created by medieval dining practices. The trenchers used as plates during the meal provided their own disposal, challenges and opportunities. These thick slices of bread, soaked with meat juices and sauce residues, were traditionally collected after the meal and distributed to the poor who gathered at the castle gates. This practice fulfilled religious obligations of charity while disposing of food waste in a useful manner, though it also created additional work for servants who had to organize the collection and distribution. The leftover food from the lord's table was subject to complex rules that governed its distribution among the household. Choice scraps might be reserved for the lord's personal servants as a form of additional compensation, while lesser remains went to feed the general servant population. Nothing edible was wasted, as the careful management of food resources was essential for surviving the winter months when fresh provisions were unavailable. As evening approached, the kitchen staff began preparations for the lighter evening meal. That would conclude the day's formal dining. This supper was typically simpler than the afternoon feast, often consisting of bread, cheese, and ale, with perhaps some preserved fruits or nuts. However, even this simple meal required careful preparation and service that maintained the social protocols essential to medieval household management. The servants' evening work extended far beyond food service to include the maintenance tasks essential for keeping the castle functioning. Fires had to be banked for the night in ways that conserved fuel while preventing complete extinction. Water supplies had to be replenished for morning use, and the endless cleaning tasks had to continue despite the servants' fatigue from the day's intensive labor. The physical toll of servant life during winter became most apparent in the evening hours when the day's accumulated exhaustion combined with the constant cold to challenge even the strongest constitutions. The servants' dormitory offered minimal comfort, thin blankets, hard sleeping surfaces, and inadequate heating that made rest more of an endurance test than a restorative experience. Yet these same servants would rise before dawn the following morning to begin the cycle anew. The social dynamics among the servants became most complex during the evening hours when the day's work was complete, but the dormitory's close quarters forced continued interaction. Friendships and rivalries that developed in the kitchen and throughout the castle continued into the sleeping hours, creating social networks that could provide support or conflict depending on the personalities involved. As the winter night settled over Goodrich Castle, the servants faced the same questions that haunted all medieval households during the challenging winter months. Would their strength hold up under the constant physical demands of castle service? Would the carefully preserved food stores last until spring brought fresh options? And would they find ways to maintain not just survival, but the small pleasures and human connections that made life bearable even in the harsh realities of medieval existence? The answers to these questions would unfold over the long winter months ahead, written in the daily struggle of ordinary people whose labor sustained the elaborate social structures of medieval life. Their stories, largely unrecorded in the grand chronicles of kings and nobles, were nonetheless essential to understanding how civilization itself survived the annual challenge of winter's test. In the heart of every medieval castle stood a space that transcended mere function to become something approaching the sacred. The Great Hall, where the rituals of winter feasting transformed survival into celebration, hierarchy into harmony, and the simple act of eating into a complex ceremony that reinforced the very foundations of medieval society. As you enter the Great Hall of Goodrich Castle, on a December evening in 1347, you can almost feel the weight of tradition settling over the assembled company like a heavy, warming cloak. The Great Hall itself was an architectural marvel designed not merely to shelter diners from winter's bite, but to create a sacred space where the elaborate rituals of medieval dining could unfold with proper dignity and meaning. The soaring stone walls rose 30 feet above the floor, their height calculated to accommodate the massive timbers that supported the roof, while creating a sense of grandeur that impressed visitors and reinforced the lord's status. These walls were not bare stone, but canvases decorated with tapestries, painted murals, and displays of weaponry that told stories of the family's history and achievements. The central hearth dominated the hall's geography, its massive stone, construction capable of burning entire tree trunks that provided both warmth and dramatic illumination for the evening's ceremonies. The fireplace was positioned to heat the entire hall while creating a focal point around which the evening's activities would revolve. The smoke from this central fire rose through carefully designed openings in the roof, carrying with it the aromas of cooking food and burning wood that would forever mark the hall as a place of warmth and abundance. The arrangement of tables within the hall followed principles that were both practical and deeply symbolic. The high table, positioned on a raised platform at the far end of the hall, commanded a view of the entire space while physically elevating the lord and lady above all other diners. This elevated position was not merely decorative, it allowed the lord to observe his household, monitor the behavior of guests and servants, and maintain the visual authority that medieval lordship required. The other tables, arranged in careful, geometric patterns that maximized seating while maintaining proper social distances, created a physical map of the castle's social hierarchy. Those seated closest to the high table enjoyed higher status and better food, while those farther away received both their food and their social positioning in descending order of importance. This seating arrangement was inviolable, controlled by a master of ceremonies who understood every nuance of rank and precedence within the household. The preparation of the hall for evening dining began hours before the first guests arrived, as servants worked to transform the daily workspace into a ceremonial venue worthy of the rituals that would unfold there. Fresh rushes were scattered across the stone floors, mixed with dried herbs that would release pleasant fragrances when crushed underfoot. These rushes served multiple purposes. They provided insulation against the cold stone floors, absorbed spills and food debris, and created a fragrant carpet that enhanced the sensory experience of dining. The lighting of the hall required careful attention to both practical and ceremonial needs. Dozens of candles made from expensive beeswax for special occasions, or cheaper tallow for daily use, were positioned to provide adequate illumination while creating an atmosphere of warmth and intimacy. The candles were arranged in iron candelabras that could be raised or lowered to adjust the lighting, while additional illumination came from oil lamps and the dramatic flickering of the central hearth fire. The table linens represented another layer of ceremonial preparation that demonstrated the household's wealth and attention to proper protocol. The finest white linen cloths, washed and pressed by Agnes and her assistants, covered the tables in careful arrangements that extended precisely to the floor on all sides. These linens were not merely decorative, they served as the foundation for the elaborate place settings that would guide the evening's dining rituals. Dame Eleanor supervised the placement of individual trenchers at each dining position, ensuring that the thick slices of day-old bread were arranged with mathematical precision along the table's lengths. The trenchers served as both plates and markers of individual dining spaces, their size and quality reflecting the status of each diner. The lord and lady received the finest trenchers made from the whitest bread, while lesser diners made do with coarser bread that reflected their position in the hall's hierarchy. The positioning of shared serving vessels followed equally precise protocols. Salt cellars, the most important shared items on medieval tables, were placed according to strict rules that divided diners into social groups. Those seated above the salt, closer to the high table, enjoyed higher status than those positioned below the salt, farther from the lord's position. The salt itself was precious enough to require careful guarding, and its placement served as a visible marker of social boundaries within the dining community. Water basins and towels were positioned throughout the hall for the ritual hand-washing that would precede the meal. This ceremony served both hygienic and religious purposes, as the washing of hands before dining was considered essential for both cleanliness and spiritual preparation. The water was heated and scented with herbs, while the towels were made from the finest linen available to the household. Brother Francis prepared the chapel adjacent to the great hall for the religious observances that would frame the evening's festivities. Medieval dining was never purely secular. It was embedded within a framework of religious observance that blessed the food, gave thanks for divine provision, and reinforced the Christian worldview that shaped all aspects of medieval life. The chaplain's preparations included arranging the sacred vessels and vestments needed for the blessing ceremonies. The musical preparations for the evening required their own complex coordination. The castle's minstrels, led by Master Geoffrey the Harper, tuned their instruments and rehearsed the songs that would accompany different phases of the feast. Medieval dining was accompanied by carefully selected music that enhanced the ceremonial atmosphere while providing entertainment during the longer courses. The choice of music reflected both the season and the status of the evening's guests. As the December afternoon faded into early winter darkness, the hall began to glow with the warm light of dozens of candles and the dancing flames of the central hearth. The servants made their final preparations, adjusting the arrangement of serving vessels, ensuring that wine and ale were properly heated for service, and positioning themselves for the complex choreography of service that would begin when the horn sounded to announce the feast. The arrival of diners followed strict protocols that reinforced the social hierarchies essential to medieval order. The lord and lady entered last after all other diners had taken their assigned positions, creating a ceremonial moment that emphasized their elevated status. Their entrance was announced by fanfare from the castle's musicians, marking the formal beginning of the evening ceremonies. The seating process itself was a carefully orchestrated ritual that required each diner to understand their precise position within the household hierarchy. The master of ceremonies guided guests to their appropriate places, ensuring that no one sat above their proper station while preventing conflicts that could arise from disputed precedents. This process could take considerable time when important guests were present, as each adjustment to accommodate a visitor required corresponding adjustments throughout the hall. Once seated, the assembled company awaited the ceremonial hand-washing that would formally begin the meal. Servants moved through the hall carrying heated water in precious vessels, offering each diner the opportunity to cleanse their hands in preparation for the feast. The washing proceeded in strict order of precedence, beginning with the lord and lady and continuing through the assembled company according to their social rank. The blessing of the food marked the transition from preparation to consumption, as Brother Francis offered prayers that sanctified the meal and gave thanks for divine provision. These prayers served multiple purposes. They fulfilled religious obligations, created a moment of unity among diners of different social ranks, and formally marked the beginning of the feast. The chaplain's words reminded all present that their abundance was a gift from God, not merely the result of human effort. The first course of the meal was served with ceremony that matched the elaborate preparations. Servants entered the hall in procession, carrying dishes that had been arranged not merely for nutrition, but for visual impact. The presentation of food was an art form that demonstrated the household's prosperity while providing sustenance for the long winter night ahead. The Lord's portion was served first, with the finest cuts of meat and the most elaborate preparation, reserved for the high table. The carving of meat at the Lord's table was performed by skilled servants who understood both the technical aspects of butchery and the social significance of their work. The distribution of different cuts reflected not only culinary preferences, but social hierarchies that determined who received the choicest portions. The serving of wine and ale followed its own ceremonial patterns, with the finest beverages reserved for the highest-ranking diners, while lesser drinks were distributed according to social position. The wine service included a formal tasting by the Lord's cupbearer, a ceremony that served both to ensure the wine's quality and to demonstrate the elaborate protocols that surrounded every aspect of noble dining. As the first course progressed, the hall filled with the sounds of conversation, music, and the general activity of a community gathered for the central ritual of their daily life. The acoustic properties of the great hall had been designed to accommodate these sounds, while allowing important announcements and toasts to be heard throughout the space. The mixing of voices created a warm audio backdrop that enhanced the sense of community and shared experience. The entertainment between courses provided both amusement and instruction, as medieval feasts included storytellers, musicians, and performers who educated as well as entertained. These performances often included moral instruction, historical tales, and religious stories that reinforced the values and beliefs of medieval society. The entertainment was carefully selected to be appropriate for the season and the composition of the evening's dining company. The protocols governing conversation during the meal reflected both practical considerations and social hierarchies. Diners were expected to speak primarily with those seated near them, maintaining conversation levels that did not disturb others while observing topics that were appropriate for mixed company. Political discussions were generally avoided, while conversations about literature, music, and courtly matters were encouraged. The second course brought additional ceremonial elements, including the presentation of specially prepared dishes that demonstrated the kitchen's skill and the household's prosperity. These courses often included elaborate preparations that required hours of work and expensive ingredients, serving as displays of wealth and hospitality that reinforced the Lord's status among his guests and household. As the evening progressed, the ceremony of dining evolved to include toasts and formal recognitions that acknowledged important relationships and obligations within the medieval social system. These toasts followed prescribed forms that honored guests, recognized service, and reinforced the bonds of loyalty that held medieval society together. The sharing of drink from communal vessels symbolized these bonds while creating legal and social obligations that extended beyond the immediate feast. The great hall itself seemed to participate in these ceremonies, its stone walls and soaring ceiling creating an acoustic and visual environment that enhanced the sense of occasion. The interplay of candlelight and firelight created shifting patterns of illumination that transformed the familiar space into something magical and mysterious, worthy of the important social and spiritual functions it served. Yet even as the ceremonies unfolded with practiced precision, questions lingered in the warm air of the great hall. How long could these elaborate rituals continue if the winter proved harsh and food stores dwindled? What tensions might arise if guests remained longer than expected, straining both food supplies and the social protocols that governed medieval hospitality? And how would these ancient ceremonies adapt if the changing world beyond the castle walls challenged the social order they were designed to preserve and celebrate? As the second course of the evening feast commenced, the great hall of Goodrich Castle transformed into a stage where the intricate choreography of medieval service unfolded with the precision of a sacred ritual. Every movement of the servants, every gesture of the diners, and every element of the meal's presentation followed patterns that had been refined over centuries of practice, creating a complex dance that reflected not merely practical needs, but the deepest values of medieval society. The service of food followed protocols so elaborate they bordered on the theatrical. Servants entered the hall in carefully ordered processions, their movements coordinated to avoid collision while ensuring that each dish arrived at its intended destination at precisely the right moment. The timing was crucial. Food that arrived too early would cool before consumption, while delayed service could disrupt the entire sequence of courses that formed the evening's ceremonial structure. Master Edmund, the castle's chief steward, stood at the edge of the hall directing the service with subtle gestures that guided the servants through their complex duties. His position allowed him to observe the entire hall while remaining inconspicuous enough not to distract from the dining ceremonies. The steward's role was crucial for coordinating the multiple elements of service while ensuring that proper protocols were maintained throughout the meal. The carving of meat at the high table was performed with ceremonial precision that elevated a practical necessity into an art form. The carver, specially trained in both technical skills and social protocols, approached his work with the solemnity of a priest performing a religious ritual. Each cut was calculated not only for flavor and tenderness, but for the visual impact that would demonstrate the household's prosperity and the Lord's generosity to his assembled guests. The art of medieval carving required years of training to master properly. Different types of meat demanded different techniques. Roasted fowl was carved with delicate precision that preserved the bird's shape while revealing the succulent interior, while joints of beef and pork were sliced to maximize both presentation and palatability. The carver had to understand not only anatomy and knife skills, but also the social significance of his work, as the distribution of different cuts reflected and reinforced the hierarchical relationships within the dining community. The presentation of each carved portion followed its own ceremonial requirements. The finest cuts were offered first to the lord and lady, followed by honored guests in order of their social importance. Lesser cuts were distributed according to strict hierarchical rules that everyone in the hall understood, but that were never explicitly stated. This distribution served both practical and symbolic purposes. It ensured that the most important diners received the best food, while reinforcing the social order that governed all aspects of medieval life. The sauce service added another layer of complexity to the meal's ceremonial structure. Different sauces accompanied different meats and courses, each requiring its own serving vessel and serving protocol. Medieval sauces were essential for making preserved foods palatable, but they also served ceremonial functions that demonstrated the household's sophistication and access to expensive ingredients. The preparation and presentation of sauces reflected both culinary skill and social status. The finest sauces made with expensive imported spices and precious wine were reserved for the high table and honored guests. Lesser sauces, while still carefully prepared, used more common ingredients and were distributed to diners of lower status. This differentiation in sauce quality served as another marker of social hierarchy, while ensuring that all diners received food that was both nutritious and palatable. Brother Francis played a continuing role in the feast's ceremonial structure, offering prayers and blessings that marked transitions between courses and reminded all present of the religious framework that governed medieval life. These interventions served multiple purposes. They provided spiritual guidance, created moments of unity among diners of different social ranks, and reinforced the religious worldview that shaped medieval understanding of prosperity, generosity, and social obligation. The timing of the chaplain's prayers had to be coordinated with the service of food to avoid disrupting the meal's flow while ensuring that proper religious observances were maintained. This coordination required communication between the steward and the chaplain that was subtle enough not to distract from the ceremony while ensuring that spiritual and practical needs were both met appropriately. The wine service involved its own elaborate ceremonial protocols that reflected both practical considerations and social hierarchies. The Lord's cupbearer, a position of great trust and responsibility, was charged with ensuring both the quality and safety of the wine served at the high table. The cupbearer's duties included not only tasting the wine to verify its quality, but also managing the elaborate etiquette surrounding wine service at medieval feasts. The sharing of wine cups was a ceremonial act that created and reinforced social bonds among the diners. The communal cup, passed among diners according to strict protocols, symbolized the unity of the dining community while acknowledging the hierarchical relationships that governed their interactions. The act of sharing drink from the same vessel carried legal and social significance that extended far beyond the immediate meal, creating obligations and relationships that could last for years. The positioning and movement of servants throughout. The hall followed patterns that maximized efficiency while maintaining the ceremonial dignity essential to medieval dining. Servants moved along predetermined routes that avoided crossing in front of important diners while ensuring that service remained unobtrusive and timely. These movement patterns had been developed over years of practice and were passed down from experienced servants to newcomers as part of their training in castle service. The serving vessels themselves carried ceremonial significance that reflected both their practical function and their symbolic importance. The finest silver and gold vessels were reserved for the high table, where their precious metals demonstrated the Lord's wealth, while their elaborate decorations told stories of family history and achievement. Lesser vessels, while still functional and attractive, were made from pewter, wood, or ceramic materials that reflected the social status of their intended users. The presentation of bread throughout the meal involved its own ceremonial elements that went far beyond simple nutrition. Different types of bread served different ceremonial functions. Fine white bread demonstrated prosperity and status, while coarser bread provided practical nutrition for diners of lesser rank. The trenchers that served as plates would eventually be collected and distributed to the poor, transforming the dining ceremony into an act of charity that fulfilled religious obligations while managing food waste. The entertainment between courses served both to amuse the diners and to provide instruction in the values and beliefs that shaped medieval society. Musicians, storytellers, and performers presented carefully selected material that was appropriate for the season, the composition of the dining company, and the ceremonial nature of the occasion. Medieval entertainment often included moral lessons, historical tales, and religious stories that reinforced social bonds while providing enjoyment. The positioning of entertainers within the hall had to be carefully managed to ensure that their performances enhanced rather than disrupted the dining ceremonies. Musicians played from designated areas where their music could be heard throughout the hall without interfering with conversation or service. Storytellers and other performers were positioned to be visible to all diners while remaining respectful of the social hierarchies that governed the seating arrangements. The conversation patterns during the meal reflected both the acoustic properties of the Great Hall and the social protocols that governed medieval dining. Diners were expected to speak primarily with those seated immediately around them, maintaining conversation levels that allowed private discussion while not disturbing others. The topics of conversation were influenced by the season, the composition of the dining company, and the formal nature of the occasion. The Great Hall's design enhanced these conversation patterns through acoustic properties that had been carefully considered during construction. The height and shape of the ceiling created sound patterns that allowed quiet conversation while enabling important announcements and toasts to be heard throughout the space. This acoustic design was essential for maintaining both the intimate nature of small group conversations and the communal aspects of the larger gathering. As the feast progressed, the ceremonial elements became more elaborate and significant. Special dishes that required months of preparation were presented with appropriate fanfare, while toasts and formal recognitions acknowledged important relationships and obligations within the medieval social system. These ceremonies served to reinforce the bonds of loyalty and obligation that held medieval society together, while celebrating the prosperity and generosity that made such elaborate hospitality possible. The management of timing throughout the feast required careful coordination. Among all participants, the kitchen staff had to ensure that courses were ready at precisely the right moments, while the service staff had to maintain the proper pace of presentation and clearing. The entertainment had to be coordinated with the meal's progression, and the religious observances had to be integrated seamlessly into the overall ceremony. The physical comfort of the diners was maintained through careful attention to heating, lighting, and seating arrangements that had been planned to accommodate the long duration of medieval feasts. The central hearth provided primary heating, supplemented by smaller braziers positioned throughout the hall to ensure adequate warmth for all diners. The lighting was arranged to provide adequate illumination while creating an atmosphere of warmth and intimacy that enhanced the ceremonial nature of the occasion. The social dynamics within the hall reflected the complex relationships that characterized medieval society. Tensions between individual ambition and social obligation, between personal preference and ceremonial requirement, between immediate pleasure and long-term political consideration, all played out within the context of the dining ceremony. These dynamics were managed through the elaborate protocols that governed every aspect of the feast, providing structure that prevented conflict while allowing for the expression of social and political relationships. Yet even as the ceremonies proceeded with practiced elegance, underlying concerns shadowed the festivities. How long could such elaborate displays of wealth and generosity continue if the winter proved harsh and supplies dwindled? What tensions might emerge if political circumstances changed and the relationships celebrated tonight became sources of conflict? And how would these ancient traditions adapt to the changing world beyond the castle walls, where new ideas and new challenges threatened the established order that these ceremonies were designed to preserve and celebrate? As the feast reached its culmination in the late evening hours, the Great Hall of Goodrich Castle became something more than a dining space. It transformed into a sacred arena where the deepest mysteries of medieval community were enacted through rituals that bound individuals together in networks of obligation, loyalty, and shared identity that would endure long after the winter snows had melted and spring had returned to the surrounding countryside. The most solemn moment of the evening arrived with the presentation of the boar's head ceremony, a tradition that connected the assembled diners to ancient customs that predated Christianity, while simultaneously celebrating the triumph of order over chaos, civilization over wilderness, and community over the isolating forces of winter darkness. The massive boar's head, decorated with holly and ivy, was carried into the hall on a silver platter, while musicians played the ancient carol that proclaimed victory over the fierce and dangerous forces that threatened medieval life. The symbolism of the boar's head ceremony reached deep into medieval consciousness, representing not merely the household's prosperity, but their collective triumph over the dangers that surrounded their small island of warmth and safety. The boar had long been considered one of the most dangerous animals in medieval forests, capable of killing trained hunters and their horses with its razor-sharp tusks and unpredictable temperament. To present its decorated head at the feast table was to claim mastery over nature's most threatening forces. Brother Francis blessed the boar's head with special prayers that acknowledged both its practical and symbolic significance. The blessing transformed what might have been merely a display of hunting prowess into a religious ceremony that gave thanks for divine protection against the forces of chaos and darkness. The chaplain's words reminded all present that their safety and prosperity depended not merely on human effort, but on divine grace that had to be acknowledged and honored. The carving and distribution of the boar's head followed protocols even more elaborate than those governing other courses. Only the Lord himself could make the first cut, symbolically claiming his role as protector and provider for all those gathered under his roof. The subsequent distribution of portions followed strict hierarchical rules that reflected not only social status, but also the bonds of loyalty and obligation that connected each diner to the Lord and to each other. The sharing of this ceremonial dish created lasting obligations among all who participated. Medieval dining customs recognized that eating together, particularly during elaborate ceremonies, created bonds that extended far beyond the immediate occasion. Those who shared the boar's head were bound together in relationships of mutual support and loyalty that could be called upon in times of crisis or need. The wassail ceremony that followed the boar's head presentation added another layer of sacred bonding to the evening's rituals. The wassail bowl, filled with heated ale or wine mixed with spices and honey, was passed among the diners according to ancient customs that created spiritual as well as social connections. The act of drinking from the shared bowl while offering toasts and blessings created a moment of profound unity that transcended the social hierarchies that normally separated the assembled company. The wassailing songs that accompanied this ceremony were among the oldest traditions preserved in medieval culture, their words and melodies carrying forward customs that reached back to pre-Christian celebrations of midwinter survival. These ancient songs acknowledged the community's dependence on forces beyond human control, while celebrating their collective success in surviving another year's challenges. The wassail ceremony transformed the great hall into a sacred space, where earthly and spiritual concerns merged in common celebration. The exchange of gifts during the feast served functions that went far beyond simple generosity or personal affection. Medieval gift-giving was a complex system of creating and acknowledging obligations, demonstrating status, and reinforcing social bonds that were essential for community survival. The Lord's gifts to his retainers acknowledged their service while creating expectations for continued loyalty, while gifts between equals established relationships of mutual support and cooperation. The presentation of gifts followed careful protocols that reflected both the giver's status and the nature of the relationship being acknowledged or created. The most valuable gifts were presented publicly with ceremonial speeches that explained their significance and acknowledged the relationships they represented. Lesser gifts might be exchanged more privately, but even these simple exchanges carried social and legal implications that extended far beyond the immediate gesture. The ring-giving ceremony, reserved for the most important occasions, created the strongest bonds of all medieval social relationships. When the Lord presented rings to his most trusted retainers, he was creating relationships that carried legal as well as personal obligations. The recipients were bound to provide military service, counsel, and unwavering loyalty, while the Lord obligated himself to provide protection, support, and consideration for their welfare and advancement. The gaming and entertainment that filled the intervals between ceremonial moments served to reinforce community bonds while providing relief from the formal protocols that governed most of the evening's activities. Medieval games often involved temporary reversals of social hierarchy, allowing servants to mock their masters and commoners to claim temporary authority over nobles. These inversions served as safety valves that released social tensions while ultimately reinforcing the established order through their temporary and ritualized nature. The Bean King game, played during the Christmas season, epitomized these temporary inversions of social order. A dried bean was hidden in a special cake or pudding, and whoever found it was declared king for the remainder of the evening, with authority to command even the lord and lady of the castle. This temporary elevation of a common person to supreme authority provided amusement while simultaneously reinforcing the arbitrary nature of social hierarchy and the importance of accepting one's ordained place in society. The storytelling that filled the quieter moments of the feast served educational as well as entertainment functions, passing down the accumulated wisdom of generations while reinforcing the values and beliefs that held medieval society together. Medieval stories often carried moral lessons that instructed listeners in proper behavior, correct values, and appropriate responses to the challenges of medieval life. The Great Hall provided the perfect setting for these oral traditions, with its acoustic properties allowing storytellers to reach every listener, while the intimate lighting created an atmosphere that enhanced the emotional impact of their tales. The musical performances throughout the evening served similar educational and bonding functions with songs that carried forward historical memories, moral instruction, and cultural identity. Medieval music was not merely entertainment but a repository of collective memory that preserved important information about lineage, legal rights, territorial boundaries, and social obligations. The musicians who performed in the Great Hall were keepers of cultural knowledge as well as providers of pleasure. The religious observances woven throughout the feast reminded all present of the spiritual framework that gave meaning to their material prosperity and social relationships. Brother Francis's prayers and blessings transformed eating and drinking into acts of worship, while the ceremonial elements of the feast echoed the liturgical patterns that shaped medieval religious consciousness. The Great Hall became a sacred space where earthly and heavenly concerns merged in common celebration. The charitable obligations that accompanied medieval feasting extended the evening's spiritual significance beyond the assembled company to include the broader community of those in need, the distribution of leftover food, to the poor waiting at the castle gates, transformed the feast into an act of religious charity that fulfilled Christian obligations while demonstrating the Lord's role as protector and provider for all those within his domain. The collection and distribution of the trenchers used as plates during the feast provided tangible evidence of the connection between feasting and charity. These bread plates, soaked with meat juices and sauce residues, represented valuable nutrition for those who could not afford fresh bread. Their distribution created visible links between the prosperity celebrated within the Great Hall and the Christian duty to care for those less fortunate. The evening ceremonies gradually evolved from formal dining toward more intimate gatherings, as the assembled company naturally divided into smaller groups united by shared interests, family connections, or political alliances. These smaller gatherings allowed for more personal conversation and relationship building, while maintaining the overall sense of community that the formal ceremonies had created. The Great Hall's design accommodated these shifting social patterns, providing spaces where different types of interaction could occur simultaneously. The servants' participation in the evening's festivities followed patterns that acknowledged their essential role in the household while maintaining appropriate social distinctions. The most trusted servants might receive special recognition or small gifts that acknowledged their faithful service, while all servants shared in the general prosperity through better food and occasional participation in the games and entertainment. That marked the season. As the evening drew toward its close, the ceremonies that marked the feast's conclusion served to preserve the bonds that had been created and reinforced throughout the long night of celebration. Final toasts acknowledged the relationships that connected all present, while prayers of thanksgiving recognized the divine grace that had made such prosperity and community possible. The Great Hall had served its function as a sacred space where individual survival merged into collective identity and shared purpose. The dispersal of the assembled company followed protocols that acknowledged the evening's significance while providing appropriate closure to the ceremonial activities. Guests retired to their chambers with expressions of gratitude that recognized not only the material hospitality they had received, but also their inclusion in the spiritual and social community that the feast had celebrated and reinforced. Yet, as the great hall slowly emptied and the servants began the long process of cleaning and restoration, questions lingered in the cooling air. Would the bonds created during this night of celebration prove strong enough to withstand the tests that winter would certainly bring? Could the sense of community and shared purpose that had filled the hall during the feast sustain the household through the challenging months ahead? And would these ancient ceremonies continue to provide meaning and unity in a world where change threatened the established order they were designed to preserve and celebrate? The answers to these questions would emerge in the weeks and months ahead as the medieval community that had gathered in sacred fellowship faced the practical challenges of winter survival. The Great Hall would continue to serve as their gathering place, but the true test of the bonds created during this night would come in the daily acts of cooperation, loyalty, and mutual support that would determine whether the community could survive until spring brought renewal and the promise of another year's prosperity. In the pre-dawn darkness of a December morning in 1347, as the castle's bakers began their daily ritual of transforming grain into sustenance, few could have imagined that the humble loaves emerging from Goodrich Castle's great stone ovens would serve a dual purpose that epitomized the ingenious practicality of medieval life. These were not merely loaves of bread destined for consumption, but the raw material for one of the most ubiquitous and democratic elements of medieval dining, the trencher, a thick slice of stale bread that would serve as plate, utensil, and ultimately food for both the wealthy and the poor. The trencher represented one of medieval society's most practical innovations, transforming what modern minds might consider waste, day-old bread, too stale for pleasant eating, into essential tableware that served multiple functions throughout the complex hierarchy of castle dining. The word itself derived from the Old French trancher, meaning to cut, reflecting the precise technique required to create these edible plates from loaves that had been baked specifically for the purpose. The bread, destined to become trenchers, began its journey 3 days before it would reach the dining tables of the Great Hall. Master Thomas the baker understood the precise requirements for trencher bread with the expertise of a craftsman whose knowledge had been passed down through generations of bakers. The grain mixture for trencher bread differed significantly from that used for eating bread, requiring a combination of wheat and rye that would produce loaves with the proper density and texture to serve as plates without becoming soggy or falling apart under the weight of medieval cuisine. The baking process itself was a carefully controlled operation that required precise timing and temperature management. The great stone ovens of medieval castles could accommodate dozens of loaves simultaneously, but trencher bread required specific baking conditions that produced loaves with thick, sturdy crusts and dense, even-textured interiors. The ovens were heated to lower temperatures than those used for eating bread, and the baking time was extended to ensure that the entire loaf achieved the proper consistency. The cooling and aging process was equally critical for producing proper trenchers. The freshly baked loaves were stored in dry areas where air could circulate freely around them, allowing the moisture content to decrease gradually while preventing the development of mold or other spoilage. This aging process, which took 2 to 3 days under optimal conditions, transformed soft, fresh bread into the firm, stable material needed for trencher production. The cutting of trenchers was a skilled operation that required understanding of both the bread's properties and the dining requirements it would serve. Trencher cutters used specialized knives to slice the aged loaves horizontally, creating thick, flat rounds that would serve as individual plates. The thickness of each trencher was carefully calculated. Too thin, and it would break under the weight of food. Too thick, and it would absorb too much moisture and become unmanageably soggy. The social hierarchy of medieval society was reflected even in the quality and size of trenchers provided to different diners. The lord and lady of the castle received trenchers cut from the finest white bread, made from carefully sifted wheat flour that produced a light-coloured, fine-textured product. These premium trenchers were larger and more attractive than those provided to lesser diners, serving as visible markers of social status even in the most basic elements of table service. Knights, nobles, and honoured guests received trenchers of intermediate quality cut from bread made with wheat flour that included more of the grain's natural components. These trenchers were still of good quality, but lacked the pristine whiteness and fine texture that marked the bread reserved for the highest social ranks. The size and thickness of these intermediate trenchers reflected the social position of their intended users while providing adequate service for their dining needs. The servants, common soldiers, and other lower-ranking members of the household received trenchers cut from dark bread made primarily from rye, barley, or oats. These coarser trenchers were often smaller and thicker than those provided to social superiors, but they served their function adequately while reflecting the practical reality that the finest ingredients were reserved for those of higher status. The dark colour and coarse texture of these trenchers immediately identified the social rank of their users. The preparation of trenchers for table service required additional steps beyond the basic cutting process. Each trencher was carefully inspected for cracks, holes, or other defects that might compromise its ability to serve as a plate. Damaged trenchers were set aside for other uses, while acceptable ones were arranged according to quality and size, for distribution to appropriate diners. This sorting process ensured that each diner received trenchers appropriate to their social status while maintaining the visual hierarchy that was essential to medieval dining protocol. The positioning of trenchers on the dining tables followed precise protocols that reflected both practical needs and social requirements. Each trencher marked an individual dining space, its placement determining where each person would sit and eat. The spacing between trenchers was calculated to provide adequate room for each diner while maximizing the number of people who could be accommodated at each table. This spatial organization was essential for managing the large numbers of people who gathered for meals in medieval great halls. The trencher's function as an eating surface required diners to develop specific techniques for managing their food effectively. Unlike modern plates with raised edges that contain food naturally, trenchers were flat surfaces that required careful arrangement of food to prevent items from sliding off onto the table or floor. Experienced diners learned to use pieces of bread torn from the trencher's edges to create small barriers that helped contain sauces and prevent food from escaping. The absorbent quality of bread made trenchers particularly well suited for medieval cuisine, which featured many dishes with rich sauces and gravies that modern plates might not accommodate effectively. The trencher absorbed these flavorful liquids, concentrating tastes while preventing waste of expensive seasonings and fats. This absorption also served to flavor the trencher itself, transforming it from a simple piece of stale bread into a sauce-soaked delicacy that would be eagerly consumed at the meal's conclusion. The practical advantages of trenchers extended beyond their function as plates to include their role in medieval table management and cleanup. Unlike ceramic or metal plates that required washing after each meal, trenchers were completely disposable, eliminating the enormous quantities of water and labor that would have been required to clean plates for hundreds of diners. This practical advantage was particularly important during winter months when water had to be heated over fires that consumed precious fuel, and when the castle's servants were already stretched to their limits managing the complex requirements of household maintenance. The trencher system also provided a solution to the storage challenges that would have been created by maintaining adequate supplies of conventional plates for a large medieval household. Medieval castles had limited storage space for non-essential items, and the hundreds of plates required for major feasts would have demanded storage areas that were needed for more critical supplies like food, weapons, and fuel. Trenchers could be produced fresh as needed, eliminating storage requirements while ensuring that table service was always adequate for any number of diners. The economic advantages of the trencher system were equally significant in a medieval economy where every resource had to be carefully managed and conserved. The cost of producing adequate ceramic or metal plates for a large household would have been enormous, representing an investment that many castles could not afford. Trenchers required only flour, fuel for baking, and skilled labor that was already available within the castle's household, making them an economical solution that converted simple ingredients into essential tableware. The environmental benefits of trenchers, while not understood in modern terms by medieval users, were nonetheless real and significant. The complete consumption or charitable distribution of used trenchers meant that no waste was generated by the dining process, while the biodegradable nature of bread meant that any portions that were not consumed would decompose naturally without creating long-term disposal problems. This sustainability was achieved not through conscious environmental planning, but through the practical necessities of medieval life. The trencher's role in medieval dining etiquette reflected the complex social protocols that governed all aspects of noble life. Proper trencher use required specific skills that marked educated diners and distinguished them from those unfamiliar with courtly customs. The ability to manage food effectively on a flat bread surface, to tear pieces from the trencher's edges for use as utensils, and to consume the trencher appropriately at the meal's conclusion were all markers of social sophistication that separated the refined from the common. The sharing of trenchers between diners was another aspect of medieval dining that reflected both practical considerations and social relationships. Young children, servants of lower rank, and sometimes even married couples shared trenchers as a matter of economy and social protocol. This sharing required cooperation and consideration that reinforced social bonds while reducing the total number of trenchers needed for any given meal. The pairing of diners for trencher sharing followed careful social calculations that reflected existing relationships and created opportunities for new connections. The quality of trencher bread reflected not only the baker's skill, but also the household's prosperity and access to different types of grain. During abundant years, even the servants' trenchers might be made from relatively fine flour that produced light-colored, palatable bread. During lean times, however, trencher quality declined along with other aspects of household provisioning, with coarser grains and adulterants being used to stretch the available flour supplies. These variations in trencher quality served as indicators of the household's overall economic health that were visible to everyone who participated in communal dining. The seasonal variations in trencher production reflected the agricultural cycles that governed all aspects of medieval life. The quality and availability of flour varied throughout the year based on harvest timing storage conditions, and the household's success in preserving grain supplies. Fresh grain harvested in autumn produced the finest trencher bread, while late winter and early spring trenchers might be made from grain that had been stored for months and showed signs of deterioration or insect damage. The geographic variations in trencher production reflected local agricultural conditions and cultural preferences that differed across medieval Europe. Regions with abundant wheat production could afford to make most trenchers from wheat flour, while areas where rye, barley, or oats were the primary grains produced trenchers with different textures, colors, and flavors. These regional differences created distinct local traditions in trencher production that reflected the available resources and established customs of different areas. The training required to produce proper trenchers was part of the broader education that apprentice bakers received during their years of learning the trade. Master bakers passed down knowledge about grain selection, dough preparation, baking temperatures, and aging techniques that had been refined over generations of practice. This traditional knowledge was essential for producing trenchers that met the exacting standards required for service in noble households where improper tableware could reflect poorly on the host's status and competence. The storage and preservation of trencher bread required understanding of moisture control, air circulation, and pest prevention that was similar to the knowledge needed for other food storage, but adapted to the specific requirements of bread products. Trenchers had to be kept dry enough to maintain their structural integrity while preventing the development of mold, but not so dry that they became brittle and unusable. This balance was achieved through careful selection of storage locations and containers that provided optimal conditions for aging bread. The inspection and quality control of trenchers was an important daily responsibility that ensured the dining tables would be properly supplied with serviceable tableware. Damaged or defective trenchers were identified and removed before they could reach the dining tables, where their failure could cause embarrassment and disruption. This quality control process required trained personnel who understood the standards required for different social ranks and dining occasions. The timing of trencher preparation had to be coordinated with the castle's meal schedules to ensure that properly aged bread was available when needed while minimizing waste from overproduction. This coordination required communication between the baking staff and those responsible for meal planning, as the number and quality of trenchers needed varied depending on the number of expected diners and the formality of the occasion, as the bread destined to become trenchers completed its aging process in the castle's storage areas. Questions began to emerge about the adequacy of winter grain supplies and the household's ability to maintain proper standards of hospitality throughout the challenging months ahead. Would the carefully calculated grain stores prove sufficient to provide both eating bread and trencher bread for the entire winter season? How would trencher quality be affected if the household was forced to use inferior grains or reduce the aging time to conserve supplies? And what would happen to the elaborate dining protocols that depended on proper trencher service if bread production had to be curtailed to ensure basic nutrition for the castle's inhabitants? As the winter deepened around Goodrich Castle, and the daily routine of trencher preparation became as regular as the sunrise, the humble bread plates began to reveal their profound significance in the complex web of relationships, obligations, and survival strategies that held medieval society together. Each morning brought the same careful ritual of inspection, cutting, and distribution that transformed yesterday's bread into today's tableware. But the accumulated weeks of winter dining had elevated these simple objects into something approaching the sacred in their essential role in community survival. Dame Eleanor supervised the morning distribution of trenchers with the same attention to detail that she brought to all aspects of household management, understanding that the proper assignment of bread plates was as important for maintaining social order as any other element of castle protocol. The allocation of trenchers reflected not just immediate dining needs, but also the complex social calculations that determined each person's place within the castle's hierarchy, their access to resources, and their standing within the community. That depended on shared understanding of proper roles and relationships. The morning inspection process revealed the gradual changes that winter weather imposed on trencher production and quality. The castle's storage areas, despite careful design and management, could not completely eliminate the effects of humidity, temperature fluctuations, and the natural aging process that affected all stored grain products. Some loaves that had seemed perfect when first cut showed signs of deterioration after several days of storage, requiring quick decisions about their suitability for different levels of service. Margaret of the kitchen had developed an expert eye for assessing trencher quality, able to identify subtle signs of moisture absorption, mold development, or pest damage that might compromise their function as tableware. The standards for different social ranks meant that trenchers rejected as unsuitable for the Lord's table might still be adequate for servants' use, while those deemed too poor for any table service could be repurposed for animal feed or other uses that prevented complete waste. The cutting of fresh trenchers each morning had become a meditation on the household's resource management and survival prospects. Thomas the baker calculated each slice with the precision of a military engineer, understanding that the thickness and size of each trencher represented a specific quantity of precious flour that had to be balanced against present needs and future uncertainties. Too thick, and the household's bread supplies would be exhausted before spring. Too thin, and the trenchers would fail in their essential function, creating waste and social embarrassment. The social dynamics of trencher distribution provided daily reminders of the hierarchical relationships that structured medieval life, but they also revealed the flexibility and adaptability that allowed these rigid systems to function effectively under changing conditions. When honored guests arrived unexpectedly, requiring premium trenchers that had not been planned for, the household's allocation system had to adjust quickly to provide appropriate service without shortchanging other diners whose status demanded respectful treatment. The servants responsible for placing trenchers at each dining position developed an intimate knowledge of the social relationships and political tensions that shaped castle life. They observed which guests received honored placement near the Lord's table, which household members had risen or fallen in favor, and which political alliances were being celebrated or ignored through the careful choreography of seating arrangements. The trencher placement became a form of communication that conveyed social messages without requiring direct confrontation or explicit statement. The dining process itself revealed the practical genius of the trencher system in ways that became more apparent as the winter progressed and resources became more precious. The absorption of meat juices, gravies, and sauces by the bread plates meant that no flavoring was wasted, concentrating expensive spices and fats in ways that maximized their impact on both taste and nutrition. This efficiency was particularly important during winter months, when every calorie and every trace of seasoning represented significant value. The trencher's role as both plate and eventual food created a dining experience that was fundamentally different from modern meals, requiring diners to engage with their food in ways that modern table service does not demand. The gradual softening of the bread as it absorbed liquids from the meal created a constantly changing eating surface that required attention and skill to manage effectively. Experienced diners learned to pace their eating to coordinate the consumption of placed food with the optimal moment for eating the sauce-soaked trencher itself. The social interactions surrounding trencher sharing revealed the intimate nature of medieval dining and the trust relationships that sharing food required and created. Couples who shared trenchers had to coordinate their eating pace and food preferences, creating opportunities for communication and cooperation that reinforced their personal bonds. Parents, sharing with children, used the experience to teach proper, eating behavior and social protocols that would serve the young people throughout their lives. The cleaning responsibilities associated with trencher use were minimal compared to those required for conventional plates, but they still required coordination and planning that reflected the household's overall efficiency. The collection of used trenchers at meal's end was timed to prevent them from becoming overly soggy, while ensuring that diners had adequate time to consume their bread plates if they chose to do so. This collection process had to accommodate different eating speeds and social protocols while maintaining the dignity appropriate to formal dining. The charitable distribution of used trenchers provided one of medieval society's most direct connections between noble prosperity and care for the less fortunate. The sauce-soaked bread that was collected from dining tables represented valuable nutrition for the poor who gathered at castle gates, transforming the waste products of noble dining into essential sustenance for those who might otherwise go hungry. This distribution system created visible links between social hierarchy and social responsibility that reinforced the moral obligations of wealth and power. Brother Francis supervised the daily distribution of used trenchers to the poor with the same care that he brought to other charitable activities, understanding that this simple act of giving connected the castle's prosperity to its spiritual obligations. The trenchers provided not just nutrition, but also a tangible demonstration of the Lord's generosity and concern for those under his protection, reinforcing the social bonds that held the medieval community together during the challenging winter months. The recipients of distributed trenchers represented a cross-section of medieval society's most vulnerable members: elderly peasants whose working days were over, widows without family support, disabled individuals who could not work, and children whose parents had died or could not provide adequate care. The trencher distribution served as a primitive but effective social safety net that prevented the complete destitution and starvation that could otherwise have affected these marginal members of the community. The quantity and quality of trenchers available for charitable distribution varied with the household's prosperity and the season's challenges, providing a visible indicator of the community's overall health and resources. During abundant times, the distributed trenchers might be substantial and well-flavored, representing generous portions from prosperous tables. During lean periods, the charity trenchers became smaller and less appetizing, reflecting the constraints that affected all levels of society. The timing of trencher distribution had to accommodate both the needs of recipients and the practical requirements of castle operations. The poor gathered at the gates each evening after the main meal, waiting for the collection and distribution process to be completed. This daily gathering created a regular community of recipients who developed their own social structures and support networks centered around the shared experience of dependence on noble charity. The emotional and social impact of trencher charity extended beyond mere nutrition to include the psychological benefits of inclusion in the broader community's prosperity. The recipients of used trenchers were not completely separated from the castle's dining community, but remained connected through the tangible link of shared food, even if they received it second-hand. This connection helped maintain social cohesion and prevented the complete alienation that could lead to social unrest or criminal behavior. The practical management of trencher charity required coordination between multiple castle departments and careful attention to preventing abuse or favoritism in distribution. The quantity of available trenchers was limited, and demand often exceeded supply, requiring fair distribution methods that prevented conflicts among recipients while ensuring that the most needy received priority consideration. The seasonal variations in trencher availability affected charitable distributions in ways that reflected the broader challenges of medieval resource management. Early winter distributions might be generous, reflecting the abundance of autumn harvest celebrations and the optimism of full storage chambers. Late winter charity became more constrained as household supplies dwindled and the castle's own members faced uncertainty about spring's arrival. The documentation of trencher charity was minimal compared to other castle expenditures, but the practice was nonetheless carefully monitored to ensure that charitable obligations were met while preventing excessive drain on household resources. This balance between generosity and self-preservation reflected the practical realities of medieval life, where excessive charity could threaten the survival of the charitable institution itself. The social education provided by trencher distribution taught valuable lessons about hierarchy, obligation, and community responsibility to all who participated in or observed the process. Children from the castle learned about the obligations of wealth and status, while recipients learned about the importance of gratitude and proper behavior that maintained access to charitable support. As winter progressed and the castle's grain supplies were consumed day by day in the production of both eating bread and trencher bread, questions about sustainability and long-term planning became increasingly urgent. Would the household's carefully calculated provisions prove adequate to maintain both nutrition and proper social protocols throughout the winter? How would trencher quality and availability be affected if grain conservation became necessary? And what would happen to the charitable distributions that connected the castle to the broader community if bread production had to be curtailed to ensure the survival of the household itself? As February's harsh winds rattled the shutters of Goodrich Castle, and the winter's toll became visible in the diminished stores of grain and the careful rationing that had replaced the abundance of autumn, the humble trencher had evolved from a simple dining convenience into a poignant symbol of both human ingenuity and the fragile nature of medieval survival. Each morning's cutting of bread plates had become an act of faith in the community's ability to endure until spring, while each evening's distribution of sauce-soaked remnants to the poor represented the thin line between civilization and chaos that defined existence in an age without safety nets or guaranteed tomorrows. The morning inspection of grain stores had become Hugh de Mortimer's most sobering daily ritual, as the steward calculated the remaining supplies against the estimated. Weeks until spring would bring fresh provisions and relief from winter's constraints. The flour allocated for trencher production represented a significant portion of the household's remaining grain, but it could not be eliminated without destroying the social protocols and charitable obligations that held the community together. Each trencher cut from precious flour was simultaneously an act of necessity and an act of faith in the community's survival. Thomas the baker had adapted his production methods to stretch the remaining grain supplies while maintaining the minimum standards necessary for proper table service. The trencher bread now incorporated a higher percentage of rye and barley flour, creating darker, denser loaves that provided adequate function while conserving the diminishing stores of premium wheat. These adjustments in recipe and quality reflected the practical adaptations that characterized medieval survival strategies, maintaining essential functions while reducing resource consumption to sustainable levels. The social protocols surrounding trencher distribution had subtly shifted to accommodate the realities of reduced supplies without explicitly acknowledging the household's growing constraints. The trenchers provided to servants and lower-ranking household members had decreased in size while maintaining their essential function, allowing the continuation of normal dining routines while quietly conserving resources. These adjustments were made gradually and without announcement, preserving morale while extending the supplies needed for community survival. Dame Eleanor had become expert at managing trencher allocation in ways that maintained social hierarchy, while maximizing the utility of each bread plate. Trenchers rejected as unsuitable for the Lord's table were carefully evaluated for use at lower levels of service, while those deemed inadequate for any table use were redirected to animal feed or charitable distribution. This cascading system of utilization ensured that nothing was wasted while maintaining the visual markers of social distinction that were essential for community stability. The dining experience itself had evolved to accommodate the realities of constrained resources without explicitly acknowledging the household's growing vulnerability. Diners had become more careful about managing their trenchers, ensuring that the bread plates absorbed maximum sauce and flavoring while remaining structurally sound for their complete consumption. This increased attention to trencher management was presented as refined dining behavior rather than resource conservation, maintaining dignity while adapting to necessity. The charitable distribution of used trenchers had become both more important and more constrained as winter progressed, creating tensions between the household's religious obligations and its survival needs. The number of poor seeking charity had increased as winter depleted the resources of peasant families and made survival increasingly difficult for those without adequate stores or support networks. The daily gathering at the castle gates had grown larger, while the available charity had become more limited, requiring careful management to prevent conflicts and maintain order. Brother Francis had adapted the charitable distribution system to ensure fairness while managing the growing demand that exceeded available supplies. A rotation system ensured that regular recipients received trenchers on different days, allowing more people to benefit from the charity while preventing any individual from becoming completely dependent on castle support. This system required careful record-keeping and diplomatic management to prevent resentment among those who were excluded on any given day. The quality of distributed trenchers had declined along with overall household resources, but they remained valuable nutrition for recipients who had few alternatives. The sauce-soaked bread still provided essential calories, fats, and flavoring that could mean the difference between survival and starvation for families whose own food stores had been exhausted. The recipients had adapted their own consumption patterns to maximize the nutritional value of the charity trenchers, often sharing them among family members or combining them with foraged foods to create more substantial meals. The emotional impact of trencher charity had intensified as winter progressed and survival became more uncertain for both givers and recipients. The daily distribution represented hope and community connection for those who depended on castle support, while the act of giving provided moral satisfaction and spiritual comfort for those who maintained the charitable tradition despite their own growing concerns about resource adequacy. The social dynamics surrounding trencher use had revealed the flexibility and adaptability that allowed medieval communities to survive periods of stress and uncertainty. The sharing of trenchers had become more common as the household adapted to reduced supplies while maintaining social functions, creating opportunities for increased cooperation and mutual support that strengthened community bonds during challenging times. The servants responsible for trencher management had developed increased skills in resource conservation and utilization that reflected the broader learning that took place during periods of constraint. They had learned to identify the maximum utility potential of each bread plate, to coordinate usage patterns that minimized waste, and to manage distribution systems that balanced competing needs while maintaining social order. The documentation of trencher usage had become more detailed as resources became more precious, with careful tracking of production quantities, distribution patterns, and charitable allocations that provided information essential for resource planning and management. This increased attention to record keeping reflected the growing importance of every grain of flour and every crust of bread in the household's survival calculations. The seasonal variations in trencher quality and availability had become more pronounced as winter progressed, with periodic improvements when hunting expeditions were successful or when supplies arrived from other holdings, followed by gradual decline as stores were consumed and replaced with inferior materials. These fluctuations provided visible indicators of the household's resource status that were understood by all community members without requiring explicit communication. The training of apprentice bakers had adapted to emphasize conservation techniques and alternative recipes that would be essential for surviving future periods of scarcity. The traditional knowledge of trencher production was being supplemented with practical experience in managing limited resources and maintaining quality standards under constraint, ensuring that essential skills would be preserved for future generations. Regional and cultural variations in trencher production had become more apparent as winter trade routes were disrupted and local communities became more dependent on their own resources. The specific techniques and traditions that had developed in different areas reflected local conditions and preferences that became more pronounced when external influences were reduced by seasonal isolation. As March approached, and the first tentative signs of spring began to appear, longer days, occasional thaws, and the return of migratory birds, the trencher system had proven its worth as both a practical dining solution and a flexible resource management tool that could adapt to changing conditions while maintaining essential social functions. The bread plates had served their humble purpose through one of the most challenging periods in the medieval calendar, providing sustenance, maintaining hierarchy, and connecting prosperity to charity in ways that preserved community cohesion during the season's trials. The lessons learned during the winter's trencher management would influence household planning for years to come, as the community incorporated new understanding about resource conservation, social adaptation, and survival strategies into their traditional knowledge. The trencher had proven that even the most humble elements of daily life could carry profound significance in times of challenge, serving functions that extended far beyond their apparent simplicity. The legacy of the winter's trencher service would endure in the memories and practices of all who had participated in its production, distribution, and consumption. The servants who had learned to cut each slice with careful attention to conservation, the diners who had adapted their eating habits to maximize utility, the poor who had depended on charitable distribution, and the administrators who had managed the complex systems of allocation and rationing had all been changed by their experience with this simple but essential element of medieval life. As the castle prepared for spring's arrival and the challenges of a new agricultural year, the trencher system stood ready to continue its humble service, having proven its resilience and adaptability through winter's ultimate test. The bread plates would continue to serve their practical function, but they would also carry forward the accumulated wisdom of a community that had learned to find abundance in simplicity and strength in shared purpose. The story of the trencher was ultimately the story of medieval survival itself, a testament to human ingenuity, social cooperation, and the profound connections between the material and spiritual aspects of community life. In the simple act of cutting bread to serve as plates, then distributing the remnants to feed the hungry, the medieval world had created a system that embodied its highest values while meeting its most basic needs. The trencher's tale was complete, but its legacy would continue as long as communities faced the challenge of transforming limited resources into shared prosperity and survival.